My wife smiled as the flames swallowed the hood of my car. "You should have just signed the papers," she whispered through the cracked glass. "But I survived the fire," she said, and by the time the sun came up, the digital screen in the boardroom exposed her hidden corporate takeover, along with the one unforgeable signature she never saw coming. The silence in the room was deafening. I stared at the woman I loved, the woman I shared a bed with, and I did not recognize the cold, calculating stranger staring back at me. I looked at the board of directors. Instead of acting shocked, they were nodding. Pastor Miller looked at me with a disappointed frown. She had been planting these seeds behind my back for months. She had visited their homes, attended their luncheons, and slowly painted a portrait of me as an unstable, incompetent son, ruining a heritage brand. She had poisoned the well before I even knew I was thirsty. "What are you talking about?" I rasped, gripping the edge of the counter to keep myself upright. "I am standing right here. I am completely lucid. My wife tried to murder me. She set my car on fire." Thomas shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and absolute disbelief. "The court order freezes all joint and personal assets under your name, Harrison. It cites a severe mental health crisis and a high risk of financial self-destruction. Legally, you are completely locked out of the financial system until a superior court judge reviews your psychiatric evaluation. Your available balance is absolutely zero. We cannot dispense a single dollar to you. Furthermore, Caroline explicitly warned us that you might exhibit highly erratic and paranoid behavior today." Thomas motioned subtly to the armed security guard, who immediately unclipped his radio and took a heavy step toward me. "Please, Harrison, go back to the hospital and get the help you desperately need. Do not make me call the police to escort you out." The realization crashed down on me like a collapsing building. Caroline had not just drained my accounts. She had masterfully weaponized my own money against me using the legal system. She had used the very banking institutions I trusted to build an impenetrable wall. If I argued, if I shouted that she was a violent liar, I would only be providing live evidence for her fabricated story about my mental instability. I would be arrested for causing a disturbance, committed to a ward, and drugged into submission, just as Trent had proudly promised. I stared at Thomas, seeing the absolute, unmovable finality in his eyes. I turned around and walked out of the bank without saying another word. The sky finally broke open the exact moment my rubber shoes hit the concrete sidewalk. A freezing, relentless autumn rain began to pour, soaking completely through my thin surgical scrubs in a matter of seconds. I shivered violently, my teeth chattering as the bitter cold seeped directly into my bones. The heavy white bandages on my hands grew weighted and gray with dirty rainwater, the dampness severely aggravating the raw, weeping burns beneath the gauze. I had one last desperate hope. There was one person in this town who had to see through Caroline's brilliant web of lies. Pastor David Miller. He had baptized me. He had counseled my father through his final days battling cancer. He was supposed to be my moral compass and my oldest family friend. His house was only 6 blocks from the bank, nestled in a quiet, affluent, tree-lined neighborhood. I dragged myself down the flooded streets, the heavy rain washing the soot and dried blood down my arms. I reached his covered front porch, my legs threatening to give out completely. I leaned heavily against the wooden door frame and pounded the side of my wrapped fist against the solid oak door. I waited, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing downpour. I knocked again, much louder this time. Finally, the heavy deadbolt clicked loudly. The door opened just a few inches, secured firmly from the inside by a thick brass chain guard. Pastor Miller peeked through the narrow vertical gap. He was wearing a thick, warm wool cardigan, holding a steaming ceramic mug of coffee in his hand. The stark contrast between his comfortable, fragrant sanctuary and my freezing, agonizing misery was staggering. When he saw me standing there, his eyes widened in absolute horror. "Harrison, my goodness! What are you doing out here in this terrible storm?" he gasped, taking a slight step back. "Let me in, Pastor. I pleaded, my voice barely more than a broken, desperate whisper. Please. I have nowhere else to go. Caroline locked me out of the bank. She set the fire. She tried to burn me alive in the garage last night. She is trying to steal Oakhaven Logistics with her brother. Pastor Miller's face hardened, shifting rapidly from shock to a deep, agonizing sorrow. He did not reach up to unlatch the brass chain. Instead, he pulled the oak door slightly closer to his body, narrowing the gap between us. Harrison cannot save you, Caroline announced to the crowd, but I love this company too much to let it die. That is why I took the initiative to find a real solution, a professional solution. The double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A man walked in, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He wore a dark bespoke suit that cost more than most of my drivers made in a month. He had slicked back hair and a predatory, arrogant smile. It was Trent Caroline's older brother. Harrison Caroline called me this morning from the hospital waiting room in absolute tears, the pastor said softly. She told me what happened. She told me you locked yourself in that garage because the pressure of the business finally broke your spirit. She warned me you might escape the ward and come here looking for a place to hide from the doctors. I stared at him through the narrow crack in the door, the icy rain matting my hair to my forehead and running into my eyes. Pastor, listen to me. I am telling you the absolute truth. She is lying to everyone. She forged a medical proxy. She and Trent are trying to liquidate the entire company. I just need sanctuary. I just need a telephone and a dry place to sit down and think. Pastor Miller shook his head slowly, his eyes welling with misguided, genuine tears. You are not well, son. Your mind is playing terrible, dangerous tricks on you. The company, the stress, the fear of failing your father, it has driven you to paranoia. Caroline loves you deeply. She is trying to save your life. If I let you in this house, I am only enabling your breakdown. I have to call an ambulance to safely take you back to the psychiatric ward. It really is for your own good. He reached for the edge of the heavy oak door to close it. I shoved my burned, bandaged hand right into the gap, crying out in raw pain as the heavy wood pinched my injured, blistered fingers. Do not do this to me, I begged, feeling the very last shred of my hope snapping in half. You have known me for 30 years. Look directly into my eyes. Do I look crazy to you? Do I look like a man who would intentionally burn his own father's car to the ground? Pastor Miller looked at me, but he did not see the boy he had baptized. He saw a man standing in the freezing rain wearing stolen hospital scrubs covered in black soot, actively bleeding and raving wildly about a massive corporate conspiracy orchestrated by his beautiful, charming, devout wife. He saw exactly what Caroline had brilliantly programmed him to see. I am so incredibly sorry, Harrison, he whispered, his voice trembling with righteous, misplaced pity. May God grant you peace in your healing. He pushed my wounded hand away with a gentle but firm pressure and shut the door in my face. The heavy deadbolt slid into place with a loud absolute and final click. The warm amber porch light flicked off, leaving me standing alone in the total dark. I stood frozen on the sodden welcome mat as the rain relentlessly pounded against my shoulders. The cold was no longer just physical. It was a deep, consuming void that completely hollowed out my chest. In less than 12 hours, my wife had masterfully orchestrated the complete and total erasure of my existence. She had publicly stripped away my multi-million-dollar company. She had destroyed my only sanctuary in a blazing inferno. She had locked away every single dollar I had ever earned, and now she had successfully weaponized my own community, my pastor, and my friends against me. I had absolutely nothing left. No money, no home, no reputation, no family. I stepped backward off the porch and walked slowly into the center of the empty street. The freezing downpour washed over my face, mixing with the hot tears of absolute rage and betrayal that finally broke free. I looked up at the dark, stormy sky, my ruined hands aching and throbbing at my sides. Caroline had successfully stripped me bare to absolute zero. She firmly believed she had left me with no weapons, no allies, and no will to fight back. But standing there in the freezing rain with every single tie to my past completely severed and burned away, I realized something she had fundamentally miscalculated. A man who has had everything taken from him is no longer bound by the rules of society. A man who has absolutely nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature on the face of the earth. The rain turned into a biting sleet by the time a sympathetic trucker finally pulled over on the edge of the county highway. I climbed into the cab, soaking wet and shivering so hard my teeth rattled. I told the driver to drop me near the old logging road up in the Blackwood Ridge Mountains. It was the only place Caroline could not touch. When my grandfather passed away 20 years ago, he left me a forgotten piece of property deep in the timber country. It was an off-the-grid hunting cabin that had not seen a fresh coat of paint or a human visitor since the late 90s. Because it was inherited property kept strictly in my name before the marriage, it was legally shielded from the rapid asset freeze. But standing at the end of the muddy access road watching the heavy truck drive away into the dark, I realized my sanctuary was nothing more than a wooden skeleton. Trent was a senior executive at a ruthless private equity firm out of Chicago. He was the kind of man who bought vulnerable companies, stripped them of their assets, fired the working-class employees, and sold the empty husk for a massive personal bonus. I had always despised him, and he had always treated me like a blue-collar peasant who had somehow lucked into his sister's life. I trudged 2 miles up the overgrown dirt path. The thick mud sucked at the oversized rubber hospital shoes I wore, threatening to pull them off with every single step. When the tree line finally broke, the dark silhouette of the cabin emerged against the stormy night sky. It looked exactly like a rotting corpse. The main roof sagged heavily in the center under the weight of wet pine needles and decaying shingles. Half of the wooden front porch had completely collapsed into the damp earth. There was no electricity. There was no running water. There was only the freezing, howling wind whistling aggressively through the wide cracks in the log walls. I pushed open the front door and it shrieked on rusted metal hinges, aggressively protesting my arrival. Inside, the heavy smell of mildew and animal droppings choked the stagnant, freezing air. The temperature plummeted rapidly as midnight approached. The wet hospital scrubs clung to my freezing skin like a suffocating layer of ice. Hypothermia was no longer a vague medical concept to worry about later. It was an immediate and terrifying physical reality creeping up my numb legs and settling deep into my chest. I knew with absolute certainty that if I did not build a fire immediately, I would literally freeze to death on the dirty floorboards of my grandfather's abandoned cabin. I stumbled blindly through the pitch-black room, feeling my way along the damp wooden walls until my heavy boot hit something solid near the back door. It was an old iron-wood chopping axe. The thick wooden handle was splintered and covered in decades of dry dust. I reached down and picked it up, and my battered body immediately betrayed me. The thick white hospital gauze wrapped tightly around my hands was already completely soaked with dirty rainwater and mud. Underneath those heavy bandages, my palms were a landscape of raw, weeping burns from my violent escape through the shattered car windshield. Gripping the wooden handle of the heavy iron axe sent a brutal shockwave of blinding agony straight up my arms and directly into my shoulders. I dropped the heavy tool instantly, falling hard to my knees on the filthy floor. I screamed out loud, the desperate sound completely swallowed by the roaring thunderstorm outside. The intense physical pain was unbearable, but the crushing psychological torture was infinitely worse. I curled into a tight, shivering ball on the freezing floor, pulling my knees up close to my chest in a desperate attempt to conserve body heat. The darkness inside the cabin felt suffocating and absolute. For the first time since Caroline poured that lighter fluid over the hood of my classic car, the sheer magnitude of my total defeat truly crushed my spirit. Her cold and emotionless voice echoed repeatedly in the empty room. "You are a pathetic and weak embarrassment." She had whispered those exact words at the country club right before dropping the microphone. As I lay violently shivering in the dirt, I started to believe her. I started to believe that I was exactly what she called me. I was a miserable failure who had carelessly lost the family business. I was a gullible fool who had trusted a manipulative monster. I was a worthless man dying completely alone in the freezing woods because I was not smart enough to see the trap closing tightly around my own neck. The brutal cold was quickly lulling me into a dangerous and heavy sleep. I could physically feel my rapid heartbeat slowing down to a lethargic crawl. The urge to simply close my tired eyes and let the freezing temperature take away all the pain was incredibly strong. It would be so incredibly easy to just give up and fade away. But then my mind flashed with the vivid image of Trent proudly sitting in my late father's leather office chair. I pictured Caroline offering that perfect fake smile as she liquidated the company trucks and fired the hard-working men who had watched me grow up. A deep primal spark of pure, unadulterated hatred flared to life in the pit of my freezing stomach. Hatred is a highly effective fuel when hope is completely gone. I forced my heavy eyes open. I refused to let my treacherous wife win. I absolutely refused to let her write the final, pathetic chapter of my life. I forced myself onto my numb feet. My legs felt like solid lead columns, but I dragged them toward the heavy iron axe resting in the dirt. I bent down and picked it up again. The agonizing pain tore through my burned hands, hot and sickening, but I bit down on my bottom lip so hard I tasted warm copper. I kicked open the back door and stumbled out into the relentless freezing rain. There was a large pile of old damp firewood stacked haphazardly against the side of the log cabin. I grabbed a thick piece of timber, set it squarely on the rotting chopping block, and raised the heavy iron axe high above my head. Every single swing was pure, relentless torture. The violent impact of the iron blade hitting the solid wood sent brutal vibrations directly into my open burn wounds. Warm, fresh blood began to soak rapidly through the wet, white gauze dripping steadily down the splintered wooden handle. I chopped the damp wood with a violent and desperate rhythm. I did not chop wood like an experienced outdoorsman preparing for winter. I chopped it like a dying man fighting for his literal existence. I brought the heavy axe down again and again, letting out a raw, guttural grunt of pain with every single brutal strike. By the time I gathered enough split wood to safely last the night, my white bandages were completely soaked in dark crimson, and my exhausted body was drenched in a freezing, feverish sweat. I hauled the heavy timber inside and dumped it onto the stone hearth of the massive fireplace that dominated the main living space. My grandfather had built that wide chimney entirely by hand, using large river stones over 50 years ago. I found a box of ancient, damp matches inside a rusted tin can resting on the wooden mantel. It took me a dozen agonizing tries with my slick, bleeding fingers, but I finally managed to successfully ignite a small pile of dry pine needles I scrounged from the dark corners of the room. The fire slowly caught hold of the damp wood, casting a flickering orange glow across the desolate, empty cabin. I collapsed onto the dirty floorboards directly in front of the flames, holding my throbbing, bleeding hands tightly against my chest. The radiant heat was a small mercy, but it was not nearly enough to stop the freezing storm wind from violently invading the small room. I looked up at the stone fireplace. A massive draft of icy air was blowing directly through the back of the chimney wall. A large section of the mortar near the base of the stone hearth had completely crumbled away over the decades. Several heavy river stones had shifted dangerously out of place, leaving a gaping hole that led straight out to the freezing storm outside. The icy wind was actively fighting the small, fragile fire I had just sacrificed my hands to build. I gritted my chattering teeth and crawled closer to the damaged stone wall. I desperately needed to block the freezing draft, or the fire would completely die long before morning. I reached out with both trembling hands and grabbed a loose, jagged rock the size of a standard cinder block. The harsh friction against my torn palms was excruciating, but I forcefully shoved the heavy stone back into the wide gap. It barely helped at all. The wind continued to howl aggressively through a secondary cavity located right next to the stone mantel base. Trent walked straight down the center aisle. The crowd parted for him like he was royalty. He climbed the steps to the stage and stood right next to my wife. Caroline placed a hand on his shoulder and smiled at the board of directors. I shifted my weight on my knees and grabbed another large stone, pulling it firmly to reposition it against the draft. But this particular stone did not feel right in my hands. It was perfectly rectangular, completely unlike the naturally rounded river rocks surrounding it. As I pulled it loose from the crumbling gray mortar, the stone slid out with an unnatural engineered ease. It was a false brick. The heavy rectangular block hit the wooden floorboards with a dull, heavy thud. I peered closely into the dark and dusty cavity it left behind in the thick masonry. The flickering firelight caught the straight edge of something metallic hidden deep inside the chimney wall. My breath caught sharply in my raw throat. I completely forgot about the freezing cold and the agonizing, throbbing pain in my hands. I reached my bloody, trembling fingers deep into the dark hole and grabbed hold of a solid iron handle. It was incredibly heavy. I braced my wet boots against the stone hearth and pulled backward with absolutely all of my remaining physical strength. With a harsh, grinding scrape of metal dragging against stone, a rectangular and heavily rusted lockbox slid out of the secret compartment. It was the exact size of a large corporate briefcase constructed entirely of thick industrial steel. The surface was heavily pitted with age and covered in a thick, greasy layer of chimney soot. It looked exactly like it had been permanently sealed inside that stone wall for at least 40 years. I sat back on my heels, staring in shock at the metal box resting on the dusty floorboards. My grandfather was a highly practical, straightforward man. He never kept emergency cash hidden away in shoeboxes. He trusted commercial banks. He trusted buying land. He absolutely did not play childish games with hidden treasure chests. So why did he meticulously construct a hidden vault inside an isolated hunting cabin located hundreds of miles away from our corporate logistics headquarters? The heavy brass padlock securing the front latch was completely corroded with thick green rust. I did not have a brass key, and I certainly did not have the patience to look around the dark cabin for one. I grabbed the heavy ironwood chopping axe from the floor beside me. I raised it high above my head and brought the blunt hammer side of the heavy axe head smashing down directly onto the rusted brass padlock. The old metal groaned loudly but held together. I struck it again, swinging with a desperate and primal force fueled by pure adrenaline. On the third brutal strike, the rusty internal tumblers finally shattered into pieces. The broken padlock clattered loudly onto the stone hearth. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I dropped the heavy axe and reached out with my bloody, trembling hands. I grabbed the heavy steel lid and pried it forcefully open. The metal hinges shrieked loudly, aggressively, resisting the sudden movement after decades of total silence. I expected to see tightly bound stacks of old $100 bills or maybe some forgotten antique family jewelry. But the large steel box was completely devoid of money. Inside, carefully and tightly wrapped in thick layers of heavy waterproof canvas, was a perfectly stacked series of leather-bound ledgers. The dark leather was brittle and cracked with extreme age. Resting heavily on top of the stacked books was a solid antique brass key attached to a small metal identification tag. I carefully lifted the top ledger out of the rusted box, treating the book like a highly fragile artifact. I opened the stiff leather cover. The heavy parchment pages were completely filled with my grandfather's meticulous looping handwriting. It was not a personal diary. It was a highly complex and officially notarized legal record. Every single page bore the official raised seal of a federal notary public, cleanly dated in the late 1970s. I turned the thick page, and the flickering firelight illuminated a staggering truth that completely rewrote my entire reality. The cabin was not a worthless piece of rotting junk left to the sentimental grandson as an insulting afterthought. It was an impenetrable fortress deliberately built to guard the master key to a billion-dollar empire. "My brother's firm specializes in corporate rescue," Caroline said. "They are willing to acquire a controlling interest in Oak Haven Logistics. They will inject fresh capital, restructure the archaic operations, and save the brand name. But they need the signature of the current operations director to finalize the transfer of voting rights." The brittle leather cover of the ledger crackled loudly in the quiet cabin as I opened it. I sat cross-legged on the dusty floorboards right in front of the stone hearth. The small fire I had built was beginning to die down, casting long and dancing shadows across the walls. My hands were wrapped in thick white gauze that was now stained dark brown with dried blood and mud. Every tiny movement of my fingers sent a hot spike of agony shooting up my forearms. I ignored the physical suffering. The pain was nothing compared to the absolute shock gripping my mind. I leaned closer to the dying flames to read the faded black ink spreading across the heavy parchment pages. The handwriting belonged to my grandfather. It was sharp and precise and completely devoid of any sentimental warmth. For my entire life, I believed my grandfather was just a hard-working truck driver who managed to build a modest regional delivery network. He wore faded denim overalls. He drank cheap black coffee from a thermos. He always told me that Oak Haven Logistics was built on the sweat of honest men moving cargo from point A to point B. I had spent 12 years working in the operations department trying to honor that simple blue-collar legacy. But as my bleeding fingers turned the brittle pages of the hidden ledger, the image of the humble blue-collar patriarch completely evaporated. My grandfather was not just a logistics manager. He was a ruthless and visionary real estate baron who had successfully hidden a monolithic empire right under the noses of everyone in our county. The first section of the ledger contained a series of original property deeds and land patent transfers dated all the way back to 1978. I scanned the geographical coordinates and the attached land survey maps. My breath hitched in my raw throat. My grandfather had not just purchased the 50-acre gravel lot where our warehouse and trucking depot currently sat. Over the course of a single decade, he had quietly and methodically bought up the commercial land rights for the entire surrounding industrial valley. He had purchased thousands of acres of undeveloped timber forests, abandoned quarry sites, and miles of barren riverfront property connecting our small town directly to the state border. He had placed all of those sprawling land assets into a highly complex network of holding companies. Oak Haven Logistics was nothing more than a superficial front. The delivery trucks and the loading docks were just a functional business facade designed to generate enough local revenue to comfortably pay the massive property taxes on the surrounding valley. My grandfather had literally bought the dirt beneath the entire regional supply chain, and he had deliberately kept the true value of his portfolio completely off the official corporate books to avoid drawing the attention of corporate vultures. I stared into the flickering firelight as the sheer magnitude of the revelation settled into my exhausted brain. I finally understood why a slick and predatory private equity executive from Chicago had suddenly taken an intense interest in a struggling rural delivery company. Trent did not care about our aging fleet of diesel trucks. He did not care about our shipping contracts or our loyal warehouse employees. He wanted the dirt. I pulled a secondary document from the heavy metal lockbox. It was a recent geological survey mixed with a highly confidential federal infrastructure proposal. My grandfather had somehow acquired these government planning documents years ago through his extensive political connections. The blueprints detailed a massive and highly lucrative federal highway expansion project. The United States Department of Transportation was actively planning to construct a new central interstate junction that would connect 3 major national supply chain routes. The exact center of that proposed multi-billion-dollar interstate junction was scheduled to be built directly on top of the Oak Haven Valley. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with terrifying clarity. Trent and his private equity firm had absolutely zero intention of rescuing my family business. They were orchestrating a hostile real estate acquisition disguised as a corporate bailout. If Trent successfully bullied me into signing away my voting rights, he would immediately take control of the 99-year master lease my grandfather had secured for the valley. Trent would then turn around and sell the commercial land rights to the federal government for the highway expansion. The eminent domain payouts and the subsequent commercial development rights for the new truck stops, hotels, and fueling stations would yield profits reaching well over $1 billion. A cold chill washed over me that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing draft in the cabin. I thought about Caroline. I thought about her perfect emerald gown, her sweet perfume, and the chillingly calm look on her face as she dropped a lighter onto a puddle of chemical accelerant. I finally understood her true motive. This was never about my alleged incompetence or her frustration with my business strategies. She had married me, lived in my house, and shared my bed for 8 years while quietly waiting for this exact federal highway project to receive government funding. She was an embedded corporate spy planted directly inside my marriage. Caroline and Trent had orchestrated a brilliant psychological campaign to systematically devalue the company in the eyes of the local board of directors. By convincing the town and the investors that Oak Haven Logistics was bleeding capital and on the verge of total bankruptcy, they created a false narrative of extreme financial distress. They manufactured a crisis so they could swoop in and purchase $1 billion real estate gold mine for the insulting price of a $15 million severance package. They needed me to look like a desperate and failing son who was incredibly lucky to receive a buyout offer from a generous savior. When I publicly refused to sign the transfer deed at the anniversary gala, I completely ruined their carefully constructed timeline. I became a major liability that needed to be permanently erased. But Caroline could not just divorce me. A standard divorce proceeding would trigger a massive legal audit of my family assets during the discovery phase. A forensic accountant would easily uncover the hidden land trust my grandfather had buried in the corporate bylaws. The federal highway secret would be exposed and Trent would lose his $1 billion prize. They needed to bypass the legal system entirely. Trent stepped forward. He did not look at the crowd. He looked directly at me. He held a thick leather binder in his left hand. He slammed it down onto the head table right next to my champagne glass. He opened it, revealing hundreds of pages of dense legal text. At the very bottom of the last page was a blank line with my name printed under it. They needed me dead. Or even better, they needed me completely discredited, legally incapacitated, and locked inside a psychiatric ward where no one would ever believe a single word I said. My hands shook violently as I pulled the final and most important document from the bottom of the rusted lockbox. It was bound in heavy black cardstock and sealed with red wax. The title page identified the document as the Oak Haven Master Trust Bylaws and Poison Pill Contingency. I carefully turned the stiff pages. My grandfather was a man who understood human greed better than anyone. He knew that immense wealth inevitably attracted ruthless predators. He knew that someday someone would try to steal the valley from his bloodline using manipulation or brute corporate force. So he built an impenetrable legal fortress specifically designed to crush hostile takeovers. I read the dense legal paragraphs, slowly making sure I completely understood the mechanism. My grandfather had structured the ownership of the valley so that it could never be sold, transferred, or leveraged by a corporate board of directors. The land was inextricably tied to a single exclusive voting share. And that singular voting share belonged entirely to me. But the true genius of my grandfather was the poison pill clause buried deep in the final section of the trust. I ran my bloody finger along the typewritten text. The clause explicitly stated that the master lease and all associated land rights could only be transferred through the explicit, fully sober, and entirely voluntary signature of the designated bloodline heir in front of an independent federal judge. The text went even further. If the designated heir was ever declared mentally incompetent, involuntarily committed to a medical facility, or incapacitated under any suspicious or contested circumstances, a defensive legal protocol would instantly activate. The master lease would be immediately stripped from the marital estate and automatically transferred into a locked century-blind trust. The land would be frozen and strictly preserved for agricultural conservation for 100 years. No commercial development could ever take place. No highways could be built. No billions could be made. I dropped the heavy parchment onto my lap and let out a sound that was half sob and half breathless laughter. Caroline and Trent thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had backed me into a corner where I had absolutely no choices left. They burned my hands, destroyed my reputation, and proudly waved a forged medical proxy in my face. They threatened to throw me in a straitjacket if I did not surrender my company. But in their supreme arrogance, they had no idea that they were holding a loaded gun directly to their own heads. By manipulating the hospital staff and declaring me a severe danger to myself, Caroline had unwittingly triggered the initial conditions of the poison pill. She had legally classified me as mentally compromised. If Trent attempted to present my signature on any transfer deed while I was under a psychiatric hold, the federal courts would immediately recognize the transaction as coerced. The century-blind trust would activate instantly, turning their billion-dollar real estate play into worthless, untouchable conservation land. They literally could not possess the company without my completely uncoerced public validation. They needed me to be a free, sane, and willing participant. By trying to lock me in an asylum, they had permanently locked themselves out of the vault. The despair that had been crushing my chest for the last 24 hours completely vanished. The freezing air in the cabin no longer bothered me. The throbbing agony in my burned hands suddenly felt like a badge of absolute honor. The men who built this company did not break under pressure, and I was finally ready to step out of my father's shadow and wield my grandfather's sword. I was no longer the helpless victim standing in the freezing rain begging for sanctuary. I was no longer the humiliated husband standing alone at the head table while the town laughed at me. I was the sole keeper of the master key. I controlled the ground Caroline walked on. I controlled the financial future of the man who had mocked me. They had over-leveraged their private equity firm to acquire a company they could never legally own. They had marched their entire invading army directly into a canyon, and I was the only person who held the detonator to the explosives buried in the walls, Harrison Buddy Trent said, leaning into the microphone so his voice boomed across the ballroom. You tried. You really did. But running a multi-million-dollar logistics network is not like playing with toy trucks in a sandbox. You are in way over your head. It is time to let the adults handle the business. I carefully gathered the fragile ledgers and placed them securely back inside the heavy steel lockbox. I closed the metal lid. I did not need to run away anymore. I did not need to hide in the woods and wait for the police to drag me back to a hospital bed. I was going to walk straight back into the heart of the city. I was going to give Caroline exactly what she wanted. I would play the part of the broken, defeated man right up until the very last possible second. I would let them organize their victory parade. I would let them invite the board of directors and the eager corporate investors. I would let them pop the expensive champagne in their high-rise boardroom. And then I was going to use my grandfather's brilliant legal ghost to burn their entire lives to the absolute ground. The first gray light of morning crept through the shattered window of the hunting cabin. It illuminated the thick dust motes dancing in the freezing air. I sat completely still on the filthy floorboards. The heavy steel lockbox rested open beside me. The ancient leather ledgers were stacked neatly on my lap. For the past 4 hours, I had not moved a single muscle. I had simply stared into the dying embers of the stone fireplace, while the absolute reality of my situation washed over me. The man who had driven that restored classic car into the garage last night was officially dead. Caroline had killed him. She had burned away the loyal husband. She had completely incinerated the trusting son who just wanted to honor his family legacy. She had destroyed the naive operations director who foolishly believed hard work was enough to earn respect from corporate vultures. That man was gone forever. In his place, a cold and highly calculated strategist was waking up. I looked down at my hands. The white hospital gauze was stiff with dried blood. The severe burns throbbed with a persistent, sickening rhythm. I welcomed the agonizing pain. It was a perfect emotional anchor. It kept my mind razor-sharp. I carefully wrapped the priceless ledgers back inside the heavy waterproof canvas. I placed them into the industrial steel box and locked the heavy lid. I possessed the master key to a billion-dollar real estate empire, but a key was completely useless without a heavy door to secure. I needed to build a trap. I needed a loyal army. And I could not do it alone. I stood up, completely ignoring the violent protests of my exhausted muscles. I walked out the front door into the freezing morning mist. The brutal thunderstorm had finally passed, leaving behind a bitter and biting chill that hung heavy in the desolate mountain air. The thick mud on the old logging road was treacherous and slick. I hiked 2 agonizing miles back toward the main county highway. My borrowed rubber hospital shoes were completely caked in freezing sludge, threatening to slide off my feet with every single step. I did not feel the freezing cold anymore. My entire battered body was fueled by a singular burning purpose. I reached the edge of the paved asphalt and walked another mile south until I spotted the rusted metal overhang of a decaying rural gas station. There was a battered coin-operated payphone bolted to the exterior brick wall beneath a flickering fluorescent light. I walked up to the machine. I had no coins in my pockets. I dropped to my knees and desperately searched the wet gravel around the overflowing trash cans until I found 3 discarded quarters, half buried in the mud. My bleeding, bandaged fingers fumbled clumsily as I pushed the cold coins into the metal slot. I dialed the first number from absolute memory. The line rang 4 times before a gravelly, exhausted voice answered the call. Walter Pierce was 70 years old. He had served as the lead corporate attorney for Oak Haven Logistics for 3 long decades before finally retiring to a quiet horse farm on the edge of the county. He was a ruthless legal scholar who had personally mentored my father through countless business acquisitions. He was also the only man on the board of directors who had completely refused to attend the anniversary gala the night before. I pressed the cold plastic receiver firmly against my ear. "Walter?" I said, my voice hoarse and raw from the smoke inhalation. "It is Harrison." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Harrison Walter breathed his voice thick with sudden and severe alarm. "The entire town is looking for you right now. Caroline called the police precinct at dawn. She told the authorities you violently escaped the hospital intensive care unit after suffering a severe psychotic break. She is offering a massive cash reward for your safe return to the psychiatric ward." I closed my eyes and leaned my forehead against the damp brick wall of the gas station. "She is lying, Walter. She set my car on fire and manually locked me inside the detached garage. She forged a medical proxy to have me committed because she needs me legally incapacitated. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do you remember the blind trust my grandfather established in 1978? I heard a sharp intake of breath through the receiver. "You found the master ledgers," Walter said, his tone instantly shifting from a concerned elder to a sharp, predatory legal mind. I found everything, I replied. I gave Walter the exact geographical coordinates of the logging road and told him to bring his encrypted laptop. I hung up the heavy plastic receiver. I used my final dirty quarter to make a second call. The phone rang only twice before it was snatched up aggressively. Sullivan was the head warehouse foreman at Oak Haven Logistics. He was a massive, heavily scarred military veteran who commanded absolute respect on the loading docks. He had openly despised Trent and Caroline for years. Sullivan saw right through their polished designer suits and recognized the parasitic corporate greed hiding underneath their fake smiles. "Sullivan," I said the exact moment the line connected. Boss Sullivan barked loudly into the phone, the loud ambient noise of diesel engines roaring in the background. "The morning shift is a complete disaster. Corporate suits from Chicago are swarming the warehouse right now. Trent is pacing around the loading bays, acting like he already owns the concrete we stand on. They are telling the men you lost your mind and abandoned the company to save yourself." I took a deep breath of the freezing mountain air. "I did not abandon anyone, Sullivan. I am actively building a counteroffensive. I need you to quietly walk away from the loading docks right this second. Do not tell a single soul where you are going. Drive your personal truck up to the Blackwood Ridge logging road. Bring medical supplies, hot coffee, and a clean suit that actually fits me. We are going to war." Sullivan let out a low, dangerous chuckle that vibrated through the phone line. "I am already in my truck, boss. Just point the way." I felt a hot flush of anger burn through my chest. My hands, calloused from years of working alongside my men on the loading docks, balled into tight fists. I looked at Trent, then at Caroline. "You are trying to steal my family's company," I said, my voice shaking with rage. I did not use the microphone, but the room was so quiet that everyone in the first 5 rows heard me clearly. 3 hours later, the rusted metal hinges of the hunting cabin shrieked loudly. Sullivan walked through the door carrying 2 massive military canvas duffel bags. Walter followed closely behind him, clutching a battered leather briefcase tightly against his chest. They stopped dead in their tracks the moment they saw me. I was sitting by the stone hearth in my torn, dirty hospital scrubs. My face was completely covered in dark black soot. My hands were wrapped in bloody medical gauze, but my posture was rigid and my eyes were completely clear. I was perfectly sane. Sullivan did not ask any useless questions or offer any useless pity. He immediately dropped to his knees, opened a red first aid kit, and began cutting away the filthy hospital bandages with a pair of steel trauma shears. He methodically cleaned my severe burn wounds with raw antiseptic, ignoring my involuntary flinching, and wrapped my hands in fresh, sterile dressing. Walter pulled a wooden chair up to the dying fire. He opened his heavy briefcase and pulled out a mobile cellular internet hotspot, quickly booting up his encrypted laptop. I placed my grandfather's metal lockbox squarely on the dusty floorboards between us. I unlatched the lid and handed the brittle leather ledgers directly to the old attorney. Walter put on his reading glasses and methodically reviewed the archaic legal documents. The only sound in the freezing cabin was the soft crackling of the fire and the delicate turning of heavy parchment pages. Finally, a wide, predatory smile spread across Walter's wrinkled face. "Your grandfather was a terrifying genius," Walter whispered in absolute awe. "This poison pill contingency is absolutely bulletproof. If Trent attempts to execute a corporate transfer deed while you are under a contested psychiatric hold, the entire valley automatically and irrevocably reverts into an untouchable federal conservation trust for a full century. They are legally paralyzed. They simply do not realize it yet." I looked at Walter, my mind already moving 3 strategic steps ahead of the corporate board. "That is not nearly enough," I said firmly. "I do not just want to block the real estate sale. I want to completely obliterate Trent's private equity firm from the face of the earth. I want to make sure he can never aggressively buy another local company as long as he lives. Walter, look up the public financial filings for Trent's firm. I want to see exactly how he is funding this massive hostile acquisition." Walter typed rapidly on his laptop keyboard, navigating the complex federal corporate registries. He quickly pulled up the pending commercial loan applications tied to Trent's Chicago-based equity group. Sullivan stood directly behind him, crossing his massive arms as the dense financial data populated the bright screen. "Look at this," Walter said, pointing a trembling finger at a massive column of red numbers. "Trent does not have the actual liquid cash to buy Oak Haven Logistics outright. He is heavily leveraging a massive bridge loan from a global syndicate of international commercial banks. He is deliberately using the projected value of the future federal highway expansion project as direct collateral to secure the cash for the buyout." I stared at the bright screen, calculating the absolute destruction in my head. He is borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars against commercial land he does not even officially own. Yet I realized the absolute brilliance of our legal trap unfolding clearly before my eyes. He is eagerly counting on my signature to instantly acquire the master lease. If he gets my signature on that paper, the massive bank loan clears instantly, and he immediately pays off his greedy investors. But what happens if the commercial banks suddenly discover that the underlying land is legally locked away inside an impenetrable blind trust? Walter slowly took off his reading glasses, his eyes shining with ruthless anticipation. If the banks find out the underlying asset is completely inaccessible, they will instantly pull the bridge loan. Trent's equity firm will definitively default on their massive leveraged debt by the end of the business day. The federal financial regulators will step in and completely liquidate his entire corporate portfolio to cover the massive monetary shortfall. He is literally borrowing money against a ghost. We just have to make absolutely sure the commercial bank executives see the ghost before he cashes their massive check. The three of us sat in the freezing cabin staring at the screen. The broken man was gone, replaced by a ghost army ready to burn a fraudulent empire to the ground. The roaring fire in the stone hearth finally settled into a quiet and steady burn. We had the legal ammunition to destroy my enemies, but a weapon requires the perfect line of sight to hit its target. Caroline and Trent were currently operating under the assumption that I was a terrified fugitive. They believed I was wandering the freezing streets, completely locked out of my bank accounts and hiding from the psychiatric authorities. If they even suspected that I had accessed my grandfather's hidden vault, Trent would immediately halt the commercial bank loans and scramble his legal team to protect his assets. I needed them to remain blindly confident. I needed them to walk willingly onto the trapdoor. I turned to Sullivan. The massive warehouse foreman was leaning against the log wall, his arms crossed over his chest. I asked him to drive back down the treacherous mountain road to the nearest rural convenience store and purchase a prepaid cellular phone with untraceable cash. Sullivan did not hesitate. He tossed his keys in his hand, gave a single sharp nod, and walked out into the freezing mud. While he was gone, Walter and I sat on the dusty floorboards, meticulously reviewing every single page of the ancient ledgers. Walter organized the commercial property deeds into a pristine stack. He drafted a formal legal brief outlining the exact conditions of the poison pill contingency, preparing the absolute proof we needed to show the investors. 2 hours later, the heavy wooden door pushed open. Sullivan walked in, shaking the icy sleet from his broad shoulders. He tossed a cheap plastic burner phone enclosed in a blister pack directly onto my lap. I tore open the cardboard packaging with my teeth completely bypassing the agonizing pain in my bandaged hands. I powered the small device on and listened to the digital startup chime. The bright screen illuminated my dark, soot-stained fingers. Trent let out a loud, patronizing laugh. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. He held it out to me like he was offering a piece of candy to a slow, confused child. I stared at the blinking cursor on the blank message screen. I knew my wife better than she knew herself. Caroline fed on absolute dominance. She thrived on seeing people bow to her superiority. To make her completely lower her guard, I had to offer her my throat. I had to compose a message that sounded entirely devoid of hope. I typed her phone number from memory. My injured fingers hovered over the small plastic keypad. Every keystroke was a calculated surrender. I typed the words slowly, ensuring the tone was perfectly pathetic. You win. I have nothing left. I will come to the board meeting on Tuesday and sign everything. Just leave me alone. I stared at the completed text message for a long moment. It was the ultimate white flag. I pressed the send button and placed the cheap plastic phone onto the stone hearth. The waiting was pure psychological torture. The rain hammered relentlessly against the rotting wooden shingles of the cabin roof. Walter poured a cup of lukewarm black coffee from a thermos and watched the phone with predatory patience. Sullivan paced back and forth across the narrow room, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. 10 minutes dragged by in agonizing silence. Then the small plastic phone vibrated against the stone hearth. A sharp notification tone pierced the quiet cabin. I snatched the device up. Caroline had replied. She could not simply accept my surrender gracefully. Her toxic arrogance demanded a victory lap. She needed to rub my face in the dirt one final time. I read her response out loud so Walter and Sullivan could hear the absolute venom in her words. I am glad you finally found a shred of sanity, her message read. I will inform the hospital staff to temporarily pause the involuntary psychiatric commitment order until after you sign the transfer deeds at Trent's corporate office on Tuesday morning. Do not make me reactivate the medical hold, Harrison. Wash your face, put on a suit, and behave like an adult. You bring nothing but the clothes on your back." Walter let out a booming, triumphant laugh that echoed off the log walls. He slapped his hand hard against his knee. "She just handed us the absolute final nail for her own coffin." The old attorney declared, his eyes gleaming with brilliant legal malice. "By explicitly stating in writing that she is using her forged medical proxy and the threat of a psychiatric hospital to secure your corporate signature, she has just officially documented a federal crime. That text message is undeniable proof of criminal extortion and illegal coercion. It completely validates the suspicious circumstances clause required to trigger your grandfather's poison pill trust. We could not have crafted a more perfect confession if we had dictated it to her ourselves." I handed the burner phone to Walter. He immediately connected it to his encrypted laptop and created multiple digital backups of the text exchange, ensuring the evidence was perfectly preserved and ready for the boardroom projector. The steel trap was now officially set, heavily baited, and waiting for the predators to step inside. We just had to survive the next 48 hours. Sunday bled into Monday. The freezing mountain cabin transformed into a highly disciplined tactical war room. We did not sleep. We survived on cold, canned soup and bitter instant coffee. Walter worked tirelessly compiling the ancient property ledgers, the modern federal highway proposals, and the extortion evidence into a series of devastating legal folders. He prepared exactly 12 pristine copies, one for every single member of Trent's executive board and the commercial bank representatives scheduled to attend the Tuesday buyout. Sullivan spent Monday driving his truck down to the city to conduct quiet reconnaissance. He parked across the street from Trent's towering glass and steel private equity building. He monitored the security patrols, noted the executive elevator access routes, and mapped out the exact layout of the underground parking garage. He used his old warehouse connections to quietly secure the building access codes from a sympathetic freight delivery driver. When he returned to the cabin on Monday night, we had a flawless infiltration plan. We would not need to force our way into the boardroom. They were going to open the front door and invite me directly inside. While my allies handled the logistics, I focused entirely on my physical and mental endurance. The severe burns on my hands required constant attention. Sullivan dutifully changed my heavy white gauze dressings every 8 hours. The raw, blistered skin was agonizingly slow to heal, but the fresh white bandages served a perfect dual purpose. They kept the terrible wounds clean, and they provided a highly visible, pathetic prop for my disguise. I spent hours sitting by the fire practicing the exact posture of a defeated man. I slumped my shoulders. I practiced keeping my eyes locked firmly on the floor. I rehearsed the shallow, defeated breathing of someone who had completely given up on life. "Nobody is stealing anything, champ," Trent mocked. "We are saving you from your own stupidity. If you sign this, you get to step down to a nice, quiet ceremonial role. You keep a corner office, you smile for the cameras, and you let me do the heavy lifting. We fire the dead weight in the warehouse, we sell off the aging truck fleet, and we maximize shareholder value. It is basic economics." Tuesday morning arrived with a bitter, bone-chilling frost. The violent storm had finally cleared, leaving behind a pale and anemic sunrise that barely pierced the thick canopy of the surrounding pine trees. Today was the day I walked back into the corporate world. Today was the day the ghost of my grandfather returned to reclaim his valley. Sullivan walked into the main room carrying a cheap plastic garment bag he had purchased from a discount department store down in the valley. He unzipped the thin plastic covering and pulled out a dark gray suit. It was awful. The fabric was stiff and cheap, woven from terrible synthetic blends. It lacked any structural tailoring. It was exactly the kind of suit a desperate man would buy off a clearance rack for a court appearance. "Put it on, boss," Sullivan instructed quietly, holding the cheap garments out to me. "You cannot walk into that billion-dollar high-rise wearing those bloody hospital scrubs. Caroline commanded you to wear a suit, so you are going to give her exactly what she asked for." I stripped off the filthy blue hospital scrubs, shivering violently in the freezing morning air. Every movement pulled at the tight burned skin across my shoulders and chest. I carefully pulled on the cheap white dress shirt. The collar was far too loose, hanging awkwardly around my neck. I stepped into the gray trousers. They were completely unhemmed, bunching up terribly over my heavy leather work boots. I slid my heavily bandaged hands through the sleeves of the suit jacket. The jacket sleeves were at least 2 inches too short, leaving my thick white medical gauze prominently and pathetically exposed for the entire world to see. I walked over to the small cracked mirror hanging precariously above the dry ceramic sink in the corner of the cabin. I stared at my reflection. I barely recognized the man looking back at me. The thick black soot from the garage fire was finally washed away, but my face was incredibly gaunt. Deep bruised purple circles shadowed my tired eyes from 3 completely sleepless nights. The cheap gray suit hung off my frame like a terrible oversized potato sack. The massive white bandages on my hands looked ridiculous and weak, protruding from the short sleeves. I did not look like the proud operations director of a 50-year-old logistics empire. I did not look like a man who held the master deed to a billion-dollar real estate gold mine. I looked absolutely pathetic. I looked like a desperate, broken shell of a human being who had been thoroughly crushed by the weight of his own failures. I looked exactly like a man who was ready to sign away his entire existence just to make the nightmare stop. It was the most perfect armor I had ever worn. I turned away from the cracked mirror and faced the room. Walter had finished packing the 12 legal folders into his battered leather briefcase. He snapped the heavy brass locks shut with a sharp, decisive click. Sullivan stood by the front door, zipping up his heavy canvas work jacket. He looked me up and down, taking in the terrible suit and the hunched, defeated posture I had adopted. "You look like a dead man walking." Harrison Sullivan noted his voice carrying a deep and rumbling respect. "They are not going to suspect a single thing. They are going to take one look at you and mentally spend their commission bonuses before you even reach the conference table." "That is exactly the point," I replied, keeping my voice soft and subdued to protect my healing throat. "Let them enjoy their imaginary victory. The higher they elevate their pride, the faster they will hit the concrete when the floor opens up beneath them." I picked up the heavy steel lockbox containing my grandfather's original ledgers. It was the only authentic piece of power I carried into the impending battle. I tucked the cold metal box firmly under my right arm. We walked out of the freezing hunting cabin and stepped into the bitter morning frost. Sullivan locked the heavy wooden door behind us. We climbed into his idling diesel truck. The heater was running full blast, but the warmth did absolutely nothing to thaw the cold, calculating ice that had permanently settled in my veins. Sullivan shifted the heavy transmission into gear, and we began the long, treacherous drive down the mountain toward the towering glass skyscrapers of the city. The trap was fully set. The bait was in motion. It was time to attend my own corporate funeral. The clinking of crystal glasses echoed through the grand ballroom of the Oakhaven Country Club. It was the 50th anniversary of Oakhaven Logistics, the regional distribution company my father had built from a single delivery truck into an empire that employed half of our town. I stood at the head table wearing my best suit, looking out at a sea of 200 faces. There were local politicians, our church congregation, the board of directors, and dozens of veteran warehouse workers who had known me since I was a kid sweeping the loading docks. My heart swelled with pride. I was 38 years old, the operations director, and I was about to raise my glass to honor my late father. I took a deep breath, ready to deliver a speech about loyalty, hard work, and the future of our family business. "You want to fire men who have worked for my father for 30 years, I said, staring hard into Trent's eyes. "You want to sell off the trucks and outsource the labor. You are not rescuing this company. You are going to gut it and leave this town with nothing." The heavy glass doors of the towering Chicago high-rise parted silently, allowing the bitter morning wind to follow me directly into the pristine lobby. Sullivan parked his idling diesel truck across the street, watching closely from the driver's seat as I began my long walk toward the executive elevators. The transition from the freezing, mud-stained reality of my grandfather's hunting cabin to this temple of modern corporate wealth was incredibly jarring. The lobby floor was constructed of flawless white marble that reflected the recessed lighting like a pristine mirror. Security guards in tailored black suits stood near the polished steel turnstiles. As I dragged my heavy dirt-caked work boots across the spotless floor, one of the guards immediately stepped forward, raising his hand to intercept what he clearly believed was a wandering, delusional vagrant. I did not stop walking. I simply raised my right arm, allowing the cheap gray sleeve of my ill-fitting suit jacket to slide back, exposing the thick, filthy white medical gauze wrapped tightly around my hand. I quietly stated my name and told the guard I was expected in the primary boardroom on the 50th floor. He hesitated, looking at a digital tablet in his hand, and then stepped aside with an expression of profound, unconcealed disgust. I stepped into the empty elevator cab. The doors glided shut, sealing me inside a quiet, softly lit metal box. As the digital numbers above the door began counting upward rapidly, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to feel the absolute agony radiating through my body. My hands throbbed with a relentless hot pain. The raw burns from the shattered car windshield wept beneath the tight bandages, sending fresh spikes of torment up my forearms with every single heartbeat. My chest ached deeply from the toxic smoke I had inhaled while trapped inside that burning garage. But the physical suffering was a necessary anchor. It kept my mind razor sharp. It prevented me from feeling any lingering, pathetic sentimentality for the woman waiting for me at the top of this building. I slouched my shoulders heavily, forcing my spine into a curved, submissive posture. I let my facial muscles go completely slack, practicing the hollow, dead-eyed stare of a man who had finally surrendered his soul. By the time the elevator chimed and the doors slid open on the 50th floor, the proud operations director of Oakhaven Logistics was gone. I was nothing but a broken ghost. I stepped out onto this plush, sound-absorbing carpet of the executive level. The entire floor was designed to intimidate. The walls were constructed of seamless, transparent glass, offering breathtaking, dizzying views of the sprawling city skyline below. Directly at the end of the long corridor was the primary conference room. Through the soundproof glass walls, I could see my own corporate execution already in full swing. The boardroom was a masterpiece of arrogant opulence. A massive table carved from a single, uninterrupted slab of dark mahogany stretched across the center of the room. Seated along the edges were the local board members from my hometown. These were the men who had eaten Sunday dinners at my father's house, the men who had sworn to protect our family legacy. They were currently sitting shoulder to shoulder with a group of sharp, impeccably groomed representatives from the commercial banks Trent had leveraged to fund this hostile acquisition. They were all smiling, their eyes fixed hungrily on the front of the room. Caroline stood near the panoramic window, completely bathed in the soft morning sunlight. She wore a pristine, tailored white designer suit that projected an image of absolute purity and control. A delicate crystal flute of vintage champagne rested lightly in her hand. She looked radiant, triumphant, and completely devoid of any human guilt. She was already mentally spending the billion-dollar windfall she believed she had successfully stolen. Beside her, Trent stood confidently at the head of the mahogany table. He was operating a sleek remote control, flipping through a series of brightly colored digital slides projected onto a massive wall screen. I stood quietly in the corridor, watching the presentation through the glass. Trent was breaking down the exact timeline for liquidating my family heritage. He pointed to a graph showing the immediate termination of the warehouse staff, casually referring to the destruction of their livelihoods as a simple optimization of redundant assets. He showed another slide detailing the sale of our aging trucking fleet to a massive national conglomerate. The board members nodded eagerly, openly, salivating over the massive personal bonuses Trent was promising them. They believed the nightmare was completely over. They firmly believed the inconvenient, sentimental husband had finally been broken into total submission. I took a slow, rattling breath. I pushed my bandaged hand against the heavy glass door and slowly pushed it open. The door swung inward with a soft click, but the effect on the room was explosive. The lively conversation died instantly. Trent froze mid-sentence, the red laser pointer in his hand, dropping aimlessly toward the carpet. Caroline turned away from the window, her crystal champagne flute halting halfway to her lips. Every single head in the room swiveled in my direction. The sudden silence was absolute and completely suffocating. The crowd began to stir. I looked down at the board members. I expected them to stand up and defend the legacy of the company. Instead, the lead board member, a man who had eaten dinner at my father's house countless times, crossed his arms and glared at me. "Sign the paper," Harrison, the board member, called out from his table. "Caroline has shown us the projections. The current model is unsustainable. You are putting our investments at risk with your stubborn pride." I shuffled slowly into the boardroom. I knew exactly what they saw. I was wearing the terrible unhemmed gray suit Sullivan had purchased from a discount rack. The synthetic fabric bunched up awkwardly around my shoulders. The sleeves were far too short, brutally exposing the thick, filthy medical gauze wrapped tightly around both of my hands. Dark purple bags hung heavily under my eyes. My face was gaunt and hollow. I looked like a desperate, broken creature that had accidentally crawled into a sanctuary of wealth and power. The reactions around the mahogany table were immediate and visceral. The lead board member from Oakhaven literally recoiled in his heavy leather chair, a look of profound physical revulsion washing over his wrinkled face. The commercial banking executives exchanged highly uncomfortable, nervous glances. They were clearly unsettled by the sudden arrival of a man who looked like he belonged strapped to a bed inside a locked psychiatric ward. I kept my eyes pinned firmly to the polished floorboards, playing the pathetic victim to absolute perfection. I shuffled slowly toward the single empty chair waiting for me at the far end of the long table. Caroline was the very first person to completely recover her composure. She smoothly placed her champagne flute onto a nearby silver tray and rushed across the room toward me. Her face instantly transformed, shifting seamlessly from arrogant triumph to a brilliant mask of deep, agonizing sorrow. She reached out and gently placed a warm hand on my hunched shoulder, making absolutely sure every single investor in the room could clearly see her performing the role of the tragic, endlessly supportive wife. "Harrison, sweetheart?" Caroline whispered, infusing her voice with a sickeningly sweet and trembling concern. "You look absolutely terrible. I am so incredibly relieved you decided to leave that awful cabin and join us here today. We were all so terribly worried about your state of mind." I did not pull away from her toxic touch. I simply kept my head bowed, staring blankly at the polished wood of the table. "I just want this to be over," I muttered, intentionally making my voice sound weak, raspy, and completely hollow. "It will be over very soon, darling." Caroline cooed softly, patting my shoulder with fake theatrical affection. "You are doing the absolute right thing for your health and for our future. You need time to heal your poor mind. You need to step away from all this terrible pressure before it breaks you permanently. Just sit down, take a deep breath, and let us take this heavy burden off your shoulders." She gently guided me into the heavy leather chair. I sank down into the expensive upholstery, letting my arms hang limply at my sides. The room remained incredibly tense. The banking executives watched my every movement, completely convinced I was a volatile explosive that might detonate at any given moment. Trent cleared his throat loudly, breaking the heavy silence. He stepped away from the digital projector and walked confidently toward my end of the table. He did not bother hiding his absolute contempt. He looked down at my cheap suit and my heavily bandaged hands with a mocking, victorious sneer. "I am genuinely glad you found a rare moment of clarity today," Harrison Trent said briskly. His voice carried the sharp, commanding authority of a man who firmly believed he owned the entire world. "It takes a certain kind of humility to finally admit when you are completely out of your depth. Your father built a nice little local delivery route, but the modern economy requires a totally different breed of ruthless leadership. We are going to protect the investor capital today, and we are going to make sure you have a very quiet, very heavily medicated early retirement." Trent reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal documents. He tossed them casually onto the mahogany table right in front of me. The heavy paper slid across the polished wood and bumped gently against my bandaged hands. I looked down at the bold black text printed across the top page. It was the master transfer deed. It was the precise legal instrument that would completely strip away my voting rights, dissolve my family legacy, and hand Trent absolute control over the massive commercial land lease safely hidden beneath Oakhaven Logistics. "Sign it," another voice yelled from the back. "This is the final surrender," Trent stated coldly, tapping the documents with his index finger. "We have already streamlined the complex legal process to accommodate your unfortunate medical situation. The board has already voted unanimously to accept my buyout terms. The commercial bank representatives sitting right here have fully approved the massive bridge loans to cover the financial transition. Every single piece is completely ready. We are simply waiting on your authorization." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy, ornate gold fountain pen. He uncapped it smoothly and laid it deliberately on top of the signature line. The gold metal gleamed brightly under the recessed ceiling lights, an expensive tool designed to sign away my entire life. "Sign the papers," Harrison Trent commanded, crossing his arms over his chest. "Sign the papers right now and you can go back to the hospital and get the psychiatric help you desperately need before Caroline has to make that difficult phone call to the state ward." The entire boardroom held its collective breath. The silence was so profound I could actually hear the soft hum of the digital projector cooling fan spinning at the front of the room. I stared down at the crisp white paper. I stared at the heavy gold pen. I could physically feel Caroline standing right behind my chair, her presence hovering over my neck like a dark and suffocating shadow. I knew she was mentally counting the billions of dollars she was about to steal from my bloodline. I knew the board members were eagerly waiting for the exact moment I legally erased my own existence so they could collect their checks. I slowly raised my right hand. The thick white medical gauze brushed lightly against the mahogany table. I reached out toward the gold fountain pen. My fingers trembled violently. It was not a fake theatrical tremor. The raw burns underneath the bandages throbbed with a sickening hot agony as I forced my damaged muscles to flex and grip the heavy metal barrel. I picked the pen up from the desk. The cold gold felt incredibly heavy against my torn and blistered flesh. I moved my injured hand directly over the printed legal document. I hovered the sharp metal nib directly above the dotted signature line. "Good boy," Trent whispered softly, a nasty, victorious smirk finally breaking across his arrogant face as he leaned in closer to watch his triumph become a reality. I kept the pen hovering over the paper for 5 agonizingly long seconds. I let them fully savor the absolute peak of their imaginary triumph. I let them taste the billions of dollars they genuinely thought they had successfully stolen. I let Caroline believe she had completely and utterly broken my soul into tiny pieces. I stared at the blank line, feeling the immense and powerful weight of my grandfather's ghost standing right beside me in the room waiting for my final decision. And then I stopped trembling. My physical posture completely changed in a fraction of a second. The pathetic, submissive slouch instantly vanished from my spine. I sat up perfectly straight in the heavy leather chair, pulling my shoulders back. I lifted my head and looked directly into Trent's eyes. The fake, hollow expression I had been wearing all morning dissolved entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolutely unyielding stare that made his smug smile falter. Trent frowned, sudden confusion flashing across his features as he noticed the dramatic and terrifying shift in my demeanor. "Harrison," he warned sharply, his voice losing its confident edge. "Do not play games today. Just sign the damn document." I looked at the heavy gold pen resting securely between my bandaged fingers. I tightened my grip completely, ignoring the fiery pain shooting through my raw palms. I placed my thumbs firmly in the exact center of the expensive metal barrel. With a single sudden and violent motion, I snapped the gold pen completely in half. The sharp, echoing crack of the breaking metal cracked through the silent boardroom like a gunshot. A thick spray of dark black ink exploded from the ruptured internal cartridge, splattering violently across the pristine white pages of the transfer deed and spraying directly onto Trent's expensive silk tie. I looked at the politicians I had donated to. I looked at the church friends I had helped through hard times. Caroline had completely manipulated their greed and their fear. She had convinced them that my loyalty to the workers was a financial disease that was going to cost them their dividends. The entire ballroom, 200 people I thought I knew, stood united against me. The pressure was suffocating. The walls of the country club felt like they were closing in on me. Trent jumped backward, cursing loudly as the dark ink permanently stained his pristine clothing. Caroline gasped sharply, stumbling away from the back of my chair in absolute shock. The commercial banking executives sitting around the table flinched in their seats, their eyes widening in sudden panicked alarm. The collective illusion of a smooth, peaceful corporate transition completely shattered and turned to dust in a single second. I tossed the 2 broken, leaking halves of the gold pen onto the ruined legal documents. The dark ink pooled rapidly, soaking deep into the paper and completely obliterating the signature line they had spent months trying to secure. "I am not signing anything," I said. My voice was no longer a weak and pathetic whisper. It was loud, firm, and carried the absolute resonant authority of a man who owned the very ground they were all standing on. I pushed my heavy leather chair back and stood up slowly, towering over the ruined documents. I looked at the stunned faces of the board members. I looked at the terrified banking representatives. Finally, I locked my eyes firmly on Caroline and her arrogant brother. The time for playing the helpless victim was completely over. The Trojan horse had successfully breached the fortress walls, and I was finally ready to show them the real monster hiding inside. The sharp and echoing crack of the breaking metal cracked through the silent boardroom like a gunshot. A thick spray of dark black ink exploded from the ruptured internal cartridge of the expensive fountain pen, splattering violently across the pristine white pages of the transfer deed and spraying directly onto Trent's expensive silk tie. Trent jumped backward, cursing loudly as the dark liquid permanently stained his pristine clothing. Caroline gasped, sharply, stumbling away from the back of my chair in absolute shock. The commercial banking executives sitting around the massive mahogany table flinched in their seats, their eyes widening in sudden and panicked alarm. The collective illusion of a smooth and peaceful corporate transition completely shattered and turned to dust in a single second. I tossed the 2 broken, leaking halves of the gold pen onto the ruined legal documents. The dark ink pooled rapidly, soaking deep into the paper and completely obliterating the signature line they had spent months trying to secure. I pushed my heavy leather chair back and stood up slowly, towering over the ruined contracts. I did not say a word. I simply gave a subtle nod toward the back of the room. Walter stepped out of the shadows. The retired corporate attorney moved with a surprising and fluid speed for a man of his advanced age. He reached the heavy double glass doors, pulled them firmly shut, and engaged the solid steel deadbolt lock from the inside. The sharp and mechanical clack of the locking mechanism echoed with terrifying finality. We were completely sealed inside the 50th floor boardroom. Sullivan stepped forward from the opposite corner, presenting a massive and imposing wall of muscle that effectively blocked any potential exit path. The investors began to murmur nervously, shifting uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs. Trent wiped the black ink from his face, his initial shock rapidly morphing into intense outrage. "What is the exact meaning of this?" Trent shouted, his voice cracking with a high-pitched and desperate anger. "Security. Somebody call the building security right now." Trent pushed the gold pen closer to my chest. He smirked, his eyes full of wicked triumph. "Just sign it, Harrison. Don't make this any more embarrassing than it already is. Look at them. Nobody here believes in you." Nobody moved to pick up a telephone. I walked calmly past Trent, leaving him standing uselessly over his ruined documents. I moved directly to the head of the mahogany table, taking absolute command of the specific space he had occupied just seconds ago. I reached out and pulled the digital presentation cord from Trent's sleek laptop, plugging it directly into a small and heavily encrypted mobile device Walter had placed on the wooden podium. You wanted to present the bright future of Oakhaven Logistics to the board of directors, I said. My voice carried a cold and unwavering resonance that filled every single corner of the quiet room. But before we discuss the financial future, we urgently need to address the events of the very recent past. We need to look at exactly how far my loving wife was willing to go to secure this corporate transition. I tapped the illuminated touchscreen on the device. The massive digital projector screen on the wall behind me flickered to life. Trent's colorful financial graphs and optimistic profit projections completely vanished. The display went pitch black for a tense and agonizing second. Then crisp and high-definition video footage illuminated the entire boardroom. It was the synchronized cloud backup of the dashcam footage from my destroyed 1968 Chevelle. When I rebuilt that classic engine, I had also installed a modern and top-of-the-line security system equipped with front and rear cameras that automatically uploaded directly to a secure remote server. The intense heat of the garage fire had melted the physical hard drive inside the vehicle, but the wireless data transmission had successfully uploaded every single frame of the ambush before the car battery completely failed. The board members leaned forward in their chairs, completely mesmerized and deeply confused by the dark video playing above them. The footage clearly showed the interior of my detached garage on the exact night of the anniversary dinner. The digital timestamp in the lower corner actively verified the hour. The room watched in total and breathless silence as the heavy side door of the garage opened on the screen. The bright fluorescent lights flickered on, revealing Caroline. She was still wearing the stunning emerald evening gown from the country club gala. The high-definition audio microphone perfectly captured the sharp clicking of her high heels on the concrete floor. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Caroline gasped, her voice trembling violently as the color rapidly drained from her face. She lunged forward, desperately trying to reach the podium to unplug the mobile device. "Turn that machine off immediately. You have no legal right to play doctored videos in this building." Sullivan stepped effortlessly into her path and crossed his massive arms. He did not lay a single finger on her, but his sheer physical presence forced her to stumble backward in absolute terror. On the massive wall screen, the digital version of Caroline walked right up to the driver's side window. The microphone picked up her chillingly calm voice with crystal-clear precision. The entire board of directors listened in mounting horror as she verbally belittled me. They heard her happily admit to orchestrating the psychological manipulation of the local town. They heard her proudly confess to organizing the hostile buyout with her brother to secure a massive financial payout. The commercial bankers sitting at the table went completely pale. The lead Oakhaven board member, the exact same man who had aggressively ordered me to sign the papers just minutes ago, dropped his jaw in unadulterated shock. I looked out at the crowd one last time. I saw the confused, fearful faces of my warehouse workers standing near the kitchen doors. They were the men who had taught me how to drive a forklift. They were the men who had wept at my father's funeral. If I signed that paper, Trent would fire them by Friday to boost his quarterly profit margin. I looked down at the contract. I looked at the gold pen. Then I looked at my wife. "I will never sign this," I said. But the video was far from over. The boardroom watched as Caroline walked over to the electronic wall panel and manually disabled the main automated garage door. They watched her pull the heavy deadbolt shut from the inside. And then, a collective and highly audible gasp ripped through the boardroom as the screen showed her grabbing the large yellow plastic bottle of professional-grade lighter fluid. "No," Trent whispered, taking a staggering step away from the mahogany table. "No, this cannot be real." The video showed Caroline methodically dumping the highly flammable chemical accelerant all over the hood of my classic car. It captured the exact moment she pulled the silver metal lighter from her designer clutch. The sensitive microphone picked up the distinct metallic flick of the spark. And then her final and venomous whisper boomed directly through the high-end corporate surround sound speakers. "You should have signed it over." The screen erupted into a blinding wall of bright orange fire as the lighter fluid violently ignited. The video fed the roaring and terrifying sounds of the inferno into the quiet boardroom for 5 agonizing seconds before the camera feed finally shorted out and the massive screen faded completely to static. The silence that immediately followed was heavier than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was the crushing and absolute silence of a meticulously crafted lie being completely annihilated by the undeniable truth. Caroline was backed against the panoramic glass window, her trembling hands covering her mouth, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Her pristine white designer suit suddenly looked like a cheap and highly transparent costume. The brilliant facade of the devoted and tragic wife was entirely incinerated. The board members stared at her, their eyes wide with profound disgust and absolute fear. They had willingly followed a woman who had casually attempted to burn her own husband alive for a corporate payout. I did not let the intense shock settle. I needed to drive the final legal stake directly through the heart of their financial empire while they were paralyzed. I reached down and picked up my grandfather's heavy industrial lockbox from the floor. I slammed the rusted steel container onto the exact center of the mahogany table. The brutal impact rattled the crystal water glasses and jolted the bankers out of their stunned paralysis. I flipped the metal lid open and pulled out the brittle and leather-bound ledgers. I tossed them directly into the center of the table, letting the heavy parchment pages fall open for everyone to clearly see. That video provides the absolute proof that my wife attempted to murder me. I stated, my voice ringing with an unwavering and razor-sharp clarity. But she did not act alone. This entire hostile buyout was a highly coordinated and criminal conspiracy designed to steal a billion-dollar real estate asset that my family has secretly held for over 4 decades. I turned my attention entirely to the commercial bank representatives sitting on the right side of the table. They were the men holding the massive bridge loans that Trent was eagerly using to fund his acquisition. I slapped Trent's hand away. The gold pen clattered onto the hardwood floor and rolled off the stage. I grabbed the heavy leather binder, closed it forcefully, and shoved it back into Trent's chest. He stumbled backward, his arrogant smile vanishing in an instant. You gentlemen authorized hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate leverage for Trent's private equity firm, I said, pointing an accusing finger directly at the lead banker. You approved the massive funding because Trent presented Oakhaven Logistics as a company holding highly valuable land assets. He showed you the confidential federal zoning maps for a new interstate junction. He promised you that by acquiring my logistics network, his firm would automatically acquire the commercial land resting securely beneath it. The lead banker swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He slowly nodded his head, confirming the strict terms of their massive financial commitment. He blatantly lied to you. I delivered the killing blow. Oakhaven Logistics does not own a single square inch of the valley it operates on. My grandfather cleverly separated the operational company from the commercial land rights back in 1978. Oakhaven Logistics is nothing more than a tenant holding a 99-year lease. I slid the original property deeds and the notarized master lease across the polished wood, pushing them right into the banker's trembling hands. The land itself is held safely inside a completely separate family trust, I explained, maintaining relentless eye contact with the terrified investors. A trust that can only be transferred with my explicit, voluntary, and legally uncoerced signature. And my grandfather was a highly cautious man. He embedded a strict poison pill contingency directly into the foundational bylaws. If any hostile entity attempts to force a transfer, or if the designated heir is ever incapacitated under suspicious medical or psychiatric circumstances, the entire land trust instantly and permanently locks down. I paused, letting the devastating reality of my words sink deeply into their greedy and panicking minds. By forging a medical proxy and maliciously manipulating a hospital into placing me under an involuntary psychiatric hold yesterday morning, Caroline officially triggered the poison pill defense. The land is completely gone. It has automatically reverted into a century-long federal conservation trust. No highways can be built. No commercial development can ever take place. The billion-dollar real estate asset you loaned Trent the money to acquire simply does not exist anymore. It is an untouchable ghost. The reaction was immediate and utterly catastrophic. The banking executives erupted into a frantic frenzy of panicked shouts. They grabbed their expensive briefcases, rapidly dialing their elite legal departments on their cellular phones. The lead banker stood up, his face flushed with pure and unadulterated rage as he pointed a violently shaking finger directly at Trent. "You committed massive federal bank fraud!" the banker screamed, completely abandoning his polished professional decorum. "You deliberately leveraged a 9-figure bridge loan using collateral you do not actually own and can never legally possess. Your entire equity firm is utterly exposed to the debt. We are pulling the funding immediately. We are calling in the massive loan right now. You are completely finished in this industry." The magnificent corporate house of cards collapsed in a matter of crucial seconds. The realization of his absolute financial ruin hit Trent like a physical sledgehammer to the chest. The arrogant posture, the smug superiority, the expensive bespoke suit, none of it mattered anymore. He was staring directly down the barrel of total financial annihilation and decades in a federal penitentiary for massive commercial fraud. Trent let out a primal and animalistic scream of pure and desperate fury. He completely lost his mind. He lunged wildly across the mahogany table, diving directly toward me with his hands outstretched, desperately trying to wrap his fingers around my throat in a final act of violence. He never even made it halfway across the wood. My father did not build a spreadsheet. I shouted, my voice raw and loud enough to reach the back of the room without a microphone. He built a family. He built a community. You can play your boardroom games all you want, but you are not touching Oak Haven logistics. Sullivan moved with the terrifying and precise speed of a highly seasoned military veteran. The massive warehouse foreman intercepted Trent mid-air, wrapping a thick and heavily muscled arm tightly around the executive's neck and driving him violently down into the polished wooden floor. Trent crashed hard against the floorboards, gasping wildly for breath as Sullivan effortlessly pinned his arms behind his back, pressing a heavy knee firmly between his shoulder blades. "Stay exactly where you are, corporate," Sullivan growled. His voice was a deep and menacing rumble that easily echoed through the chaotic room. "You are not touching him." Caroline watched her powerful brother get slammed effortlessly into the carpet. She saw the wealthy bankers fleeing to the far corners of the room, shouting desperately into their phones. She looked up at the massive video screen still displaying the frozen and damning image of her own face illuminated by the raging garage fire. The total reality of her catastrophic failure finally broke entirely through her sociopathic delusions. She spun around quickly and bolted toward the heavy double glass doors. She gripped the metal handle and yanked frantically, her high heels slipping wildly on the plush carpet. She screamed out loud as she realized Walter had securely thrown the heavy internal deadbolt lock. "Let me out!" Caroline shrieked, her voice completely devoid of its former sweet elegance. She pounded her fists desperately against the thick and soundproof glass. "You cannot keep me locked in here. I demand you open this door right now." Walter slowly walked over to the glass doors, holding his battered leather briefcase comfortably at his side. He did not reach for the metal lock. He simply smiled a cold and deeply satisfied smile and pointed his finger out into the 50th floor corridor. Through the transparent glass walls of the boardroom, Caroline saw exactly why Walter had locked the doors from the inside. We had not locked her in to trap her. We had locked the doors to safely contain the blast zone while the proper authorities arrived. Stepping out of the executive elevator bank were 6 fully uniformed city police officers, accompanied closely by 2 grim-faced detectives wearing plain clothes. They marched purposefully down the plush carpeted hallway, their metal badges gleaming brightly under the modern office lighting. Walter had personally delivered the digital backup of the dashcam footage to the precinct commander an hour before the meeting started. They were not here to negotiate a polite corporate settlement. They were here to execute an immediate arrest warrant for felony attempted murder and extortion. Caroline stared blankly through the glass as the heavily armed detectives approached the doors. Her rapid breath fogged the transparent barrier. She slowly slid down the smooth surface, collapsing completely onto her knees in her ruined designer suit, finally realizing there was absolutely nowhere left to run. 3 months later, the autumn frost had given way to the bitter chill of a deep Midwestern winter. The frantic chaos of that Tuesday morning in the Chicago high-rise had long since faded into a methodical and merciless legal reality. The modern justice system is often accused of moving incredibly slowly, but I learned firsthand that total financial and social ruin can happen in the absolute blink of an eye. I sat in my newly renovated office overlooking the Oak Haven loading docks, watching the local news on a small television screen. The anchor was actively reporting on the upcoming criminal trial of the decade. My former wife was currently sitting inside a cinder-block cell at the county correctional facility, awaiting trial for felony attempted murder and extreme corporate extortion. She had been firmly denied bail. The prosecuting attorney had played the synchronized cloud backup of the dashcam footage from my ruined classic car during her preliminary arraignment hearing. The presiding judge had taken one look at her calmly sipping vintage red wine while the garage completely burned with me trapped inside it, and immediately deemed her a severe flight risk and an extreme danger to the local community. The pristine white designer suits and expensive emerald evening gowns were completely gone forever. They were permanently replaced by a faded and deeply unflattering Orange County prison jumpsuit. The affluent socialite friends she had spent 8 long years aggressively cultivating had abandoned her the exact second the cold steel handcuffs clicked loudly around her delicate wrists. The country club elite simply do not tolerate ugly public scandal affecting their pristine reputations. They immediately blocked her phone calls completely, avoided her frantic handwritten letters, and entirely erased her from their exclusive social circles. The crowd erupted into shocked gasps. The board members shook their heads in absolute disgust. Pastor Miller turned his back to the stage and began walking toward the exit. The collective disapproval of the entire town crashed down on my shoulders like a physical weight. Trent straightened his suit jacket, his face twisting into an ugly scowl. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life," he warned in a low, dangerous tone. She even tried to use her signature charm on the courtroom staff, but the undeniable horror of the video evidence made everyone view her as a cold and calculating monster. She was left entirely alone in a cold concrete room with nothing but the terrifying reality of a 20-year mandatory prison sentence staring her directly in the face. Her arrogant brother faced a very different kind of brutal public execution. Trent did not just lose the billion-dollar real estate acquisition. His spectacular public failure triggered a catastrophic chain reaction across his entire private equity portfolio. The international commercial banks did not just pull their massive bridge loans. They immediately flagged his firm for severe fraudulent activity and contacted federal financial regulators. Within 48 hours of our intense boardroom confrontation, armed agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission had raided his pristine 50th floor offices. They aggressively seized his secure corporate servers, froze his domestic and offshore accounts, and completely locked him out of his own magnificent building. During his federal interrogation, Trent actually tried to blame the entire conspiracy on his sister, desperately attempting to throw Caroline under the bus to save his own skin, proving once and for all that there is absolutely no honor among greedy thieves. Trent was permanently barred from operating anywhere in the financial sector. His personal luxury assets, including his sports cars and penthouse apartments, were aggressively liquidated by the federal bankruptcy courts to satisfy the furious and panicked investors he had blatantly misled. The arrogant man who had openly mocked me for wearing cheap clothes and working with my calloused hands was now drowning in insurmountable federal litigation, facing a decade behind bars for massive commercial fraud. He had proudly built his entire identity on the grand illusion of absolute control, and the exact moment that control evaporated, he was reduced to absolutely nothing. But the most revealing aftermath did not involve the local police or the powerful federal courts. It involved the very people who lived and worked in my own hometown community. The exact moment the true details of the malicious extortion plot became public knowledge, the social dynamics of our town underwent a violent and hypocritical shift. The exact same prominent board members who had angrily demanded I sign away my family legacy suddenly started sending incredibly expensive gift baskets to my corporate office. Local politicians who had conveniently looked the other way during my public humiliation suddenly wanted to schedule friendly luncheons to actively discuss the prosperous future of the regional supply chain. The most audacious attempt at reconciliation came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was walking across the busy warehouse floor when I saw Pastor Miller standing hesitantly near the heavy front security gates. He was holding a large leather-bound Bible and wearing a deeply apologetic and mournful expression. This was the exact same man who had confidently locked his heavy, solid oak door right in my face while I stood actively bleeding and violently shivering on his porch, pleading for basic human sanctuary. I walked up to the iron security gates, but I did not open them. He reached his hand through the cold metal bars, offering a soft and trembling verbal apology. He told me how deeply Caroline had cleverly deceived his entire flock. He told me that the church congregation was eagerly ready to welcome me back into their loving embrace with completely open arms. I looked at him with absolute and unwavering clarity. I felt no lingering anger toward him anymore. Anger requires an emotional investment that I was simply no longer willing to provide to hypocrites. I politely and coldly explained that a spiritual sanctuary that only opens its heavy doors when the dangerous storm has completely passed is not a real sanctuary at all. I told him that my personal faith was perfectly intact, but my trust in his specific congregation was permanently and irreversibly broken. I turned my back and walked away, leaving him standing completely alone in the damp asphalt parking lot. I realized that setting incredibly firm boundaries is not an act of cruelty or vengeance. It is simply the absolute highest form of personal self-respect. I did not waste a single ounce of energy actively seeking revenge against the specific people who had cowardly abandoned me. The simple act of permanently removing their access to my life was the most powerful and devastating statement I could ever make. They had willingly chosen to align themselves with a glittering and toxic facade of wealth and deceit. When that gorgeous facade finally collapsed into dust, they expected me to eagerly offer them a soft and forgiving place to land. I refused. I respectfully declined their fancy dinner invitations, returned their extravagant gifts, completely unopened, and entirely severed all professional ties with the disloyal local board members. I bought out their remaining minority shares at a steeply discounted market rate, completely purging the toxic elements from the Oak Haven corporate registry. I was finally standing on my own solid ground, completely free from the suffocating and heavy expectations of fair-weather friends. With the corporate parasites permanently and legally removed from the complicated equation, I turned my entire unyielding focus toward the bright future of Oak Haven logistics. The massive federal highway junction was still officially scheduled to be built directly across the vast valley, but the operational terms of engagement had drastically changed. Because the hidden poison pill contingency had officially and legally activated the commercial land, was securely and permanently locked inside the century-long blind trust. My brilliant grandfather had successfully ensured that the very ground beneath our feet could never be aggressively sold to the highest corporate bidder. But the strict legal terms of the Conservation Trust still allowed for the active and prosperous operation of the original heritage business. We did not actually need to sell the valuable land to thrive. We simply needed to leverage our incredibly exclusive geographical positioning. As the new massive interstate construction began, Oak Haven Logistics naturally and immediately became the primary staging hub for the entire federal expansion project. We did not sell off our aging delivery trucks. We completely upgraded and aggressively doubled the overall size of the active fleet. I initiated a complete and total restructuring of the foundational company bylaws. I took the massive operational profits generated by the highly lucrative new federal contracts and proudly instituted a comprehensive profit-sharing program for every single dedicated employee on the corporate payroll. The veteran warehouse workers who had nervously stood by the kitchen doors during the terrible anniversary gala were no longer just blue-collar laborers working for an hourly wage. They officially became fully vested partners in the ongoing family legacy. Sullivan, the gruff and imposing warehouse foreman who had carefully bandaged my bleeding hands in a freezing mountain cabin, was officially promoted to vice president of regional operations. The daily morale on the busy loading docks completely transformed overnight. The heavy diesel engines roaring to life every single morning no longer sounded like a desperate and exhausting struggle for basic survival. They sounded like absolute and undeniable victory. As the company flourished beyond my wildest expectations, I quickly realized I needed a quiet place to securely anchor my own healing soul. I did not purchase a sprawling luxury mansion in a highly restrictive gated community to replace the beautiful suburban home I had tragically lost to the terrible fire. Instead, I took a small portion of my personal financial dividends and drove back up the deeply rutted logging road into the towering Blackwood Ridge Mountains. I hired a small dedicated crew of highly trusted local craftsmen to completely and beautifully restore my grandfather's dilapidated hunting cabin. We did not tear down the rustic wooden log walls or attempt to modernize the rugged natural aesthetic. We simply reinforced the foundational supports, repaired the heavily sagging roof, and installed proper thermal weatherproofing to keep out the bitter winter chill. I personally rebuilt the massive stone fireplace using fresh gray mortar and smooth rounded river rocks, completely and permanently sealing the hidden dark cavity where the heavy steel lockbox had rested quietly for over 40 years. We greatly expanded the wooden back porch, allowing it to perfectly overlook the beautiful and pristine alpine lake that sat quietly just beyond the dense evergreen tree line. Today, that remote and peaceful cabin is my absolute permanent sanctuary. Caroline stepped forward. The fake sympathetic smile was completely gone. Her beautiful face hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. She stepped into my personal space so close I could smell her expensive perfume. She leaned in, her lips hovering right next to my ear. "You are a pathetic, weak embarrassment," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing without this company, and I am going to make sure you lose both." Walter occasionally drives up the mountain on the weekends to sit by the lake and discuss legal theory over hot coffee. I sit on the smooth wooden deck every single evening, listening to the cold wind rustling through the ancient towering pine trees and watching the golden setting sun reflect perfectly off the incredibly calm water. The deep and terrible burn scars on my hands have finally healed into pale and jagged lines of thick tissue. I do not hide them under long sleeve shirts or heavy leather gloves. I wear them proudly every single day of my life. They are the permanent and undeniable physical proof that I successfully survived the absolute worst night of my entire existence. Life has a very strange and deeply brutal way of teaching us exactly what actually matters in this world. Caroline and Trent spent their entire pathetic lives aggressively chasing a hollow and glittering illusion of supreme power. They genuinely believed that expensive designer suits, imported luxury vehicles, and ruthless psychological manipulation were the ultimate and absolute indicators of human success. They foolishly viewed basic empathy and fierce loyalty as fatal character weaknesses to be actively exploited for maximum personal financial gain. But people who choose to build their entire existence on a highly fragile foundation of toxic deceit will inevitably and ultimately burn in the exact same fires they enthusiastically start themselves. Their massive corporate greed was incredibly loud and publicly obnoxious, but their ultimate destruction was completely silent and absolutely final. I learned the hard way that true enduring wealth does not reside in a frozen commercial bank account or a towering glass corporate high-rise building. Real wealth is the undeniable and fierce resilience required to violently crawl out of a burning building and keep moving steadily forward when the entire world has turned its back on you. It is the profound and quiet wisdom to recognize your own true immense value, even when the people you deeply love the most loudly declare you to be completely worthless. My brilliant grandfather clearly understood that a lasting legacy is never measured by the sheer volume of liquid assets you leave behind for your descendants, but by the unyielding and tested strength of the hands ultimately entrusted to carry it forward into the future. I walked directly through the blazing fire they maliciously set for me, and I emerged on the exact opposite side, firmly holding the master keys to the entire kingdom. If you have ever had someone try to burn your life to the ground, only for you to rise from the ashes stronger than before, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always comes to light. Drop a comment with your own story of survival and subscribe for more. But before I could speak a single word, a cold hand wrapped around my wrist. She pulled away, maintaining her cold, dead stare. She lifted her hand and intentionally dropped the microphone onto the wooden table. A high-pitched, piercing squeal of audio feedback blasted through the ballroom speakers. The guests covered their ears, wincing in pain. Caroline turned on her heel and walked off the stage. Trent followed right behind her, stepping over the gold pin. They walked down the center aisle, and the crowd parted for them again. I stood completely alone at the head table. The audio feedback died down, leaving a heavy, toxic silence in its wake. Nobody looked at me. The board members gathered their coats and began walking out. The mayor refused to meet my eyes. My so-called friends whispered to each other as they hurried toward the coat check. Within 10 minutes, the grand ballroom was completely empty, save for the busboys clearing the untouched champagne glasses. I had refused to surrender my father's legacy, but the cost was absolute isolation. Caroline had masterfully stripped away my reputation, my support system, and my dignity in a matter of minutes. I walked out of the country club alone, stepping into the cold night air, foolishly believing that the worst part of the nightmare was over. I had no idea that her public ambush was just a distraction, and that the real execution was waiting for me in the dark of my own garage. The heavy rumble of the restored V8 engine was the only sound keeping me tethered to reality as I drove away from the country club. My hands gripped the cracked leather steering wheel of my father's 1968 Chevelle so tightly my knuckles turned white. The cold night air whipped through the open window, but it did nothing to cool the burning humiliation radiating in my chest. I had just watched my entire life unravel in front of 200 people. The men I grew up with, the board members who had shaken my hand, the pastor who had married us. Every single one of them had looked at me with disgust, completely manipulated by the woman I had sworn to spend the rest of my life with. I pulled into the long paved driveway of our suburban home. The house was completely dark, a massive quiet structure that suddenly felt like a stranger's property. I guided the Chevelle past the main house and pulled into the detached brick garage in the backyard. I killed the engine. The headlights flickered off, plunging me into complete darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating. Only the faint metallic ticking of the cooling exhaust pipes broke the quiet. I sat there behind the wheel, emotionally shattered. I rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel and closed my eyes. 8 years of marriage, countless late nights working to keep Oakhaven logistics afloat. The sacrifices I had made to ensure my father's warehouse workers could put food on their tables. Caroline had just taken all of it and twisted it into a public spectacle of incompetence. She had tried to hand my family's legacy over to her ruthless brother Trent, and the worst part was the realization that she had been planning this ambush for months. Every smile, every dinner party, every supportive word had been a calculated lie. Suddenly, the heavy side door of the garage clicked open. The harsh fluorescent overhead lights flickered to life, blinding me for a moment. I raised my head, squinting against the sudden brightness. Caroline walked into the garage. She was still wearing the stunning emerald evening gown she had worn to the gala. Her hair was perfectly styled and her makeup was completely untouched. She did not look angry. She did not look flustered. She walked toward the car with the calm, terrifying confidence of a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. She stopped right next to the driver's side door. My window was rolled down about 2 inches, just enough to let the cool air in. I stared at her, waiting for her to yell, waiting for her to throw a tantrum about how I had embarrassed her in front of the board. But she did not raise her voice. "You are making this incredibly difficult for no reason, Harrison," she said softly. Her voice was chillingly even. She held the leather binder tightly against her chest. "I brought you a graceful exit. I gave you the chance to walk away with $1 million severance package and your pride intact. Trent was going to let you keep a corner office. You could have played the honorable son. Instead, you acted like an emotional child." My wife Caroline smoothly pulled the microphone from my fingers. She offered the crowd a dazzling, perfect smile. Her emerald evening gown caught the light of the chandeliers. For a second, I thought she was going to introduce me. We had been married for 8 years. I had supported her, trusted her, and shared every secret of my father's company with her. I stepped back, giving her the floor, completely unaware that I was stepping onto an execution block. I turned my head to look at her through the narrow gap in the window. "You set me up," I replied, my voice raspy. "You spent months convincing the board that I was unstable. You brought your brother in to gut my father's company to fire the men who built this town, and you thought I would just smile and sign it away." Caroline sighed, rolling her eyes as if I were complaining about the weather. "Those men are liabilities, Harrison. They are expensive, outdated liabilities dragging down the profit margins. You think the board cares about their families? You think Pastor Miller cares about your loyalty? They care about their dividends. The world runs on capital, not sentiment. I am trying to secure our future, and you are standing in the way because you cannot let go of a dead man's dream. I am never signing that paper," I told her, my voice hard and absolute. "You and Trent will never touch Oak Haven. I will go to the state regulators on Monday morning. I will expose Trent's buyout terms. I know he does not have the liquid capital to run the daily operations. I will tear this whole fraudulent deal apart." Caroline stared at me. The fake sympathy completely drained from her beautiful face, leaving behind something utterly hollow and terrifying. She took a slow step backward. She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply looked at me as if I were a minor mathematical error that needed to be erased from a spreadsheet. "I see," Caroline whispered. She walked over to the heavy metal side door of the garage. She pressed her hand against the electronic wall panel. A loud mechanical beep echoed through the space as she engaged the deadbolt lock on the main automated garage door, disabling the remote sensors. Then she pulled a set of keys from her small designer clutch and manually locked the side door's deadbolt. "What are you doing?" I asked, sudden confusion mixing with a rising sense of alarm. Caroline did not answer. She walked over to the wooden workbench where I kept my tools and supplies for restoring the Chevelle. She reached past the wrenches and grabbed a large yellow plastic bottle of professional-grade lighter fluid, the kind we used for the charcoal grill on the back patio. She walked back to the car. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached for the door handle, but I hesitated, unable to comprehend what my wife was actually doing. Caroline squeezed the yellow plastic bottle. A thick, clear stream of highly flammable liquid splashed against the hood of the Chevelle. She walked slowly down the side of the car, squeezing the bottle, continuously drenching the classic paint job. She let the fluid pool heavily near the rear tires, right over a large oil stain soaked deep into the concrete floor. The sharp, toxic smell of hydrocarbons instantly filled the enclosed garage, burning the inside of my nose. "Caroline, stop!" I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. "Have you lost your mind?" She tossed the empty yellow bottle onto the floor. She stepped back, standing near the locked side door. She reached into her clutch one more time and pulled out a silver metal lighter. She flicked it open with her thumb. The small orange flame illuminated her perfectly calm, emotionless eyes. She stepped closer to the pooled lighter fluid near the back tire. She looked directly at me through the cracked window. "You should have signed it over," she whispered. Caroline dropped the lighter into the puddle and quickly stepped out the side door, slamming it shut behind her. I heard the heavy deadbolt slide into place from the outside. The flames erupted with a violent, booming rush of air. The fire did not start slowly. It exploded. The liquid accelerant ignited the oil-soaked concrete, sending a massive wall of bright orange fire rushing up the sides of the Chevelle. The flames swallowed the hood instantly, feeding on the fresh oxygen in the garage. The heat hit the windshield like a physical blow. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Caroline began, her voice echoing sweetly through the massive speakers. "We are here to celebrate a legacy. William built an incredible foundation. But as we look around this room, we have to be honest with ourselves about the harsh realities of the modern economy." I frowned, looking at her side profile. This was not the script we had practiced in our living room. Panic seized my chest. I grabbed the interior door handle and yanked it hard. Nothing happened. During the restoration, I had installed an advanced aftermarket electronic security system to protect the car, tying the door locks directly into the main battery. The intense, instantaneous heat from the burning engine bay had already melted the wiring harness under the floorboards. The electronic locks had shorted out, triggering the heavy steel security pins inside the door frames. I was locked inside a metal cage. I slammed my shoulder against the driver's side door, putting all my weight into it. The door did not budge a single millimeter. The flames were licking at the outside of the window, now thick and black and furious. The heat inside the cabin was rising at a terrifying speed. The leather seats began to smoke. I scrambled over the center console, throwing myself into the passenger seat. I kicked at the passenger door, screaming for help, but my voice was completely drowned out by the roaring sound of the inferno. The fire had already reached the wooden workbench. Cans of paint thinner, old motor oil, and chemical solvents began to catch fire, feeding the blaze until the entire garage turned into a blinding, suffocating oven. The oxygen inside the car was disappearing. Black, toxic smoke began to pour through the ventilation vents, stinging my eyes and tearing at my throat. Every breath I took felt like swallowing broken glass. The heat was so intense my clothes felt like they were melting against my skin. I realized with absolute horrifying clarity that Caroline had not just tried to scare me. She intended to burn me alive, destroy the evidence, and walk away a grieving widow with full legal control of my company. Survival instinct took over. The doors were useless. The side windows were blocked by sheets of fire. My only way out was the front windshield. I threw myself onto my back across the front bench seat. I pulled my knees to my chest, positioning my heavy leather work boots directly against the thick laminated safety glass of the windshield. I braced my shoulders against the seat and kicked upward with every ounce of strength left in my body. The glass bowed outward but held firm. The heat outside was warping the metal frame. The paint on the hood was bubbling and peeling away in black flakes. I kicked again, screaming in pure desperate rage. The windshield cracked a massive spider web of fractured glass spreading from the center. The smoke in the cabin was so thick I could barely see the ceiling. My lungs screamed for air. My vision started to blur at the edges. I had seconds left before I passed out from the carbon monoxide. I drew back both legs and delivered one final brutal double kick to the center of the shattered glass. The entire windshield gave way, bursting outward and crashing onto the burning hood. A rush of superheated air flooded the cabin. I did not hesitate. I hauled myself forward, diving headfirst through the jagged, broken opening. Shards of thick safety glass sliced into my palms and forearms as I dragged my body over the ruined frame. I felt the skin on my hands tear open warm blood, instantly mixing with the black soot, but I could not stop. I tumbled over the burning hood and crashed heavily onto the concrete floor. The pain was agonizing. My hands were shredded. My lungs burned. The entire garage was an ocean of fire. The wooden roof beams were already snapping and cracking overhead. Flaming debris rained down around me. I crawled on my hands and knees, keeping my face as close to the ground as possible to find the last few inches of breathable air. I dragged myself toward the main automated garage door. Caroline had locked the electronic mechanism, but every automated door had a red manual release cord hanging from the ceiling track. Caroline paced slowly across the stage, her high heels clicking softly against the polished wood. She looked directly at the company board members sitting at the front tables. She looked at Mayor Hopkins. She looked at Pastor Miller from our church. She commanded the room with effortless grace, and then she turned her velvet words into daggers. I looked up through the blinding smoke. The cord was hanging just 3 feet above the ground, illuminated by the hellish orange glow. I forced myself to stand up, my legs trembling violently. The heat was unbearable. It felt like standing on the surface of the sun. I reached up with my bloody torn hands and grabbed the red nylon cord. I pulled downward with everything I had. A loud metallic click echoed above the roar of the fire as the locking carriage disengaged from the track. I dropped to the floor, shoving my bleeding fingers under the bottom edge of the heavy steel door. I gritted my teeth, ignored the searing pain in my flesh, and heaved upward. The heavy metal door slid up along the tracks, stopping just 2 feet off the ground. I dove under the gap, scraping my back against the concrete, and tumbled out into the freezing night air of the driveway. I hit the wet grass of our lawn and scrambled away as fast as my battered body could move. Just as I reached the edge of the yard, the fire reached the Chevelle's gas tank. The explosion shook the ground beneath me. A massive fireball blew the garage roof completely off its hinges, sending a tower of sparks and flaming wood high into the night sky. The concussive wave knocked me flat onto my back. I lay there on the cold, damp grass, gasping desperately for clean air. My hands were covered in deep lacerations, bleeding heavily into the dirt. My clothes were scorched and reeked of lighter fluid and melted plastic. I rolled onto my side, coughing up black soot, my chest heaving in violent spasms. The heat of the burning garage washed over my face, a stark contrast to the freezing temperature of the autumn night. Through the stinging tears and the thick smoke drifting across the yard, I looked toward the main house. The large bay window of our custom kitchen faced the backyard. The lights inside were turned on, casting a warm, inviting glow over the luxury countertops and stainless steel appliances. Caroline was standing right behind the glass. She was still wearing her emerald dress. She held a crystal glass of red wine in her right hand. She was looking directly at the burning remains of the garage. She did not look panicked. She was not reaching for a phone to call the fire department. She was completely, chillingly calm, watching the flames destroy the last piece of my father's legacy, confident that I was burning inside it. I lay bleeding in the dark, hidden by the shadows of the large oak tree in our yard. I watched my wife take a slow, satisfied sip of her wine. In that moment, the man I used to be, the loyal, trusting husband who had spent his life trying to see the best in people, completely died. The fire had burned away every illusion I had ever held. Caroline had tried to erase me from the world for a corporate buyout, but she had made one fatal mistake. She had left me alive. And as I stared at her silhouette against the kitchen light, a cold, unbreakable resolve took root in my chest. I was going to let her think she had won, and then I was going to tear her entire world apart. Consciousness did not return all at once, but dragged me up from the dark in jagged and agonizing pieces. The first thing that registered was the rhythmic and mechanical hissing of a ventilator forcing air somewhere nearby. Then came the smell. The sharp and sterile stench of hospital-grade bleach and rubbing alcohol assaulted my senses, desperately trying to mask the phantom odor of burning rubber and scorched flesh that still clung to the inside of my skull. I tried to open my eyes, but my eyelids felt heavy, as if they were glued shut with grit and ash. When I finally managed to force them apart, the harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit stabbed into my pupils. I blinked against the blinding glare, trying to orient myself in the unfamiliar space. The rapid beeping of a heart monitor echoed in the small and sterile room. I attempted to shift my weight and push myself up on my elbows, but a wave of pure and unfiltered agony tore through my entire body. My hands felt completely alien to me. I looked down and saw 2 massive bundles of thick white gauze resting heavily on top of the thin hospital blanket. The memory of the shattered windshield, the tearing glass, and the roaring inferno flooded back into my mind with terrifying clarity. Every nerve ending in my palms and forearms screamed in protest against the movement. I tried to take a deep breath to calm my racing heart, but my lungs seized up. They felt raw and blistered from inhaling thick and toxic black smoke. A dry and hacking cough racked my chest, sending fresh waves of pain radiating down my spine. I lay there, panting, staring up at the acoustic ceiling tiles, desperately trying to piece together the timeline of the night. I remembered the country club and the public ambush. I remembered driving home in the restored Chevelle. I remembered the locked garage door. I remembered the clear stream of lighter fluid pouring over the classic paint job. I remembered crawling under the heavy steel door just as the gas tank ruptured. By some absolute miracle, I had survived. I had crawled out of the blazing tomb my wife had meticulously prepared for me. My mind raced with the urgent need to speak to someone in authority. I needed a detective to walk through that hospital door. I needed a badge and a notepad. I had to tell the authorities exactly what happened in our backyard. I had to report the attempted murder before the evidence was washed away by the fire hoses. I turned my head toward the doorway, fully expecting to see a uniformed officer standing guard. "My husband Harrison is a good man," Caroline said, letting a heavy sigh escape her lips. She looked at me with an expression of deep, exaggerated pity. "He has a big heart. He loves this town. But a big heart does not balance a ledger. A big heart does not stop a company from bleeding capital. Harrison has spent the last 2 years desperately trying to wear his father's oversized shoes, and it breaks my heart to say this publicly, but he is drowning." Ready to take my official statement and issue a warrant for an arrest. But there was no police officer waiting in the hallway. The figure standing at the foot of my hospital bed was dressed in a perfectly tailored beige cashmere sweater and crisp white trousers. Her hair was immaculate and fell perfectly around her shoulders. She wore a delicate pearl necklace that caught the harsh hospital light. It was Caroline. The woman who had poured chemical accelerant on my car locked me inside a burning building and casually sipped a glass of red wine while waiting for me to turn to ash was standing right in front of me. My heart monitor spiked instantly, the machine emitting a rapid and panicked series of sharp beeps that filled the quiet room. The sheer audacity of her physical presence paralyzed me. I opened my mouth to scream for the nurses to shout that the woman standing in the room was a violent monster, but only a dry and raspy wheeze escaped my ruined throat. Caroline stepped closer to the side of the bed. Her face was a masterclass in psychological deception. To any doctor or nurse walking past the glass doors of the intensive care unit, she looked exactly like a devoted and traumatized wife holding a desperate bedside vigil for her injured husband. Her eyes were artificially red and puffy, suggesting hours of staged weeping in the waiting room. But as she leaned over my mattress, ensuring her back was turned to the corridor window, her expression instantly hardened into a mask of pure and calculating ice. She reached out and gently smoothed the edge of the blanket near my heavily bandaged hands. The physical proximity made my skin crawl with revulsion. "You really are incredibly stubborn, Harrison," she whispered. Her tone was casual and conversational, as if we were discussing neighborhood gossip instead of her failed attempt to incinerate me. I stood in the kitchen and watched the flames break through the garage roof. I saw the wooden structural beams collapse completely. You should be nothing but unrecognizable dental records right now. But here you are lying in a hospital bed causing completely unnecessary complications for my schedule. I tried to pull my body away from her, but I was securely tethered to the bed by intravenous lines and unimaginable physical pain. I glared at her, pouring every ounce of hatred I possessed into that single stare. I wanted to tell her that she was going to spend the rest of her natural life in a concrete federal prison cell. I wanted to tell her that the arson investigators would easily find the melted plastic bottle, the traces of chemical accelerant, and the manually locked deadbolt on the side door. But before I could force a single coherent word through my blistered vocal cords, Caroline lifted a heavy metal clipboard from the bedside rolling table. She held it up right in front of my face so I could clearly read the legal documents clipped to the front. The bold black letters across the top of the crisp white paper read, "Medical power of attorney and full psychiatric proxy." At the very bottom of the page, I saw a signature signed in blue ink. It looked exactly like my handwriting. It was a flawless, legally binding forgery. You are probably lying there wondering where the police detectives are. Caroline continued maintaining that terrifyingly calm and steady whisper. You are probably thinking you can just hit that plastic call button clipped to your pillow, bring a doctor in here and tell them your evil wife tried to murder you for the family business. I need you to listen to me very carefully, Harrison, because the reality of your current situation is much worse than you realize. While you were unconscious in the back of the ambulance fighting for your life, I had to make some very difficult and emotional phone calls. I called Pastor Miller at the church. I called the local police precinct commander. I even called the lead investors on your corporate board of directors. They were all so terribly shocked and deeply sympathetic when I delivered the tragic news about your breakdown. I managed to choke out a single raspy sentence through the burning pain in my throat. What news did you tell them? Caroline smiled, displaying a cold and empty curving of her perfect lips that did not reach her eyes. I told them that the tremendous pressure of running Oak Haven Logistics had completely broken your mind. I explained how the impending threat of bankruptcy, the emotional stress of the buyout offer, and your massive inferiority complex regarding your father finally pushed you over the edge. I wept uncontrollably in the emergency room waiting area. I put on a spectacular award-winning performance for the hospital staff. I told the attending physicians and the local police that you locked yourself in the detached garage, poured lighter fluid all over your precious classic car, and intentionally tried to take your own life. The sheer magnitude of her fabricated lie hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow to the chest. She had not just tried to physically murder me to acquire my assets. She had brilliantly weaponized the fire to destroy my reputation entirely. She had taken the massive public humiliation from the anniversary gala earlier that evening and used it as the perfect psychological motive for a fake suicide attempt. The false narrative was logically flawless. To the outside world, to my community, and to my employees, I was suddenly a defeated and incompetent man who could not handle professional failure and selfishly chose a coward's exit rather than face my problems. A low murmur rippled through the ballroom. My stomach plummeted. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I stepped forward to take the microphone back to laugh it off as a strange joke, but Caroline expertly stepped out of my reach. The doctors bought every single word I said, Caroline whispered, leaning in closer until I could smell the sharp peppermint breath mint she had just chewed. They looked at your medical chart. They looked at your severely burnt hands and your smoke-damaged lungs, and they saw a tragic mental health crisis caused by severe financial anxiety. They officially documented the incident as a severe psychotic break. Right now, on your official hospital medical record, you are legally classified as a severe danger to yourself and others. I have the forged medical proxy, Harrison. I have complete and unquestionable legal control over your healthcare decisions. I decide who is allowed to visit this room. I decide when you receive pain medication for those burns. I decide what happens to you next. My mind spun violently, frantically, searching for a way out of the trap, searching for a single crack in her psychological armor. I tried to thrash my legs under the blankets, tried to hit the nurse call button with my elbow, but she swiftly and aggressively pinned my arm to the mattress. Her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by absolute ruthlessness. If you breathe a single word to anyone about what really happened in that burning garage, Caroline warned, her voice dropping to a dangerous and guttural frequency, they will simply chalk your accusations up to severe paranoid delusions. They will think you are violently hallucinating from the physical trauma and the heavy sedatives flowing through your veins. And as your legally designated medical proxy, I will be forced to put on a brave face and make the heartbreaking decision to have you committed by the state. I will have you transferred directly from this intensive care unit to a locked high-security psychiatric ward. You will spend the next 10 years of your life in a padded room, heavily medicated on antipsychotics, screaming about an invisible murder plot that nobody in the world believes. The company board of directors will legally strip your remaining corporate shares under the mental incapacity clause of the company bylaws, and my brother will take over Oak Haven Logistics anyway. You lose your company and your freedom either way." Right on cue, the heavy wooden door of the hospital room swung open with a soft click. Trent walked into the intensive care unit looking just as arrogant and polished as he had the night before at the anniversary gala. He did not look like a concerned family member visiting a severe burn victim in the hospital. He looked exactly like a corporate shark circling a wounded and bleeding prey. He carried a sleek black leather briefcase tucked securely under his left arm. He walked over to the opposite side of the hospital bed, looking down at my bandaged, ruined hands with a look of obvious and unfiltered disgust. He did not bother offering any fake sympathy or polite greetings. He got straight to his brutal business. "Good morning," Harrison Trent said, briskly, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "You look absolutely terrible. I warned you last night that playing with corporate matches was a dangerous game for an amateur." He snapped his briefcase open on the edge of the bed and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. It was the exact same corporate transfer deed he had tried to aggressively force on me at the country club table. It was the contract that would completely surrender my family's heritage, terminate the employment of my loyal warehouse workers, and hand total voting control of the logistics network to his predatory private equity firm. He tossed the heavy stack of papers carelessly onto my rolling hospital tray table. The dull thud of the documents hitting the plastic surface felt exactly like a judge slamming a heavy wooden gavel down on my life. Trent leaned over the metal bed rail, deeply invading my personal space. "We are going to make this very simple and very fast," he said, pulling a sleek black fountain pen from his tailored jacket pocket and laying it directly on top of the signature page of the contract. "The local police department has already officially closed the investigation into the fire. They labeled the incident an attempted suicide based entirely on your wife's very compelling emotional testimony and the undeniable evidence of your very public mental meltdown at the dinner last night. The insurance company is already rapidly processing the property damage claim for the garage. You have absolutely no leverage left to negotiate with. You have no money in your frozen bank accounts. You have no allies left in town to protect you. Your beloved warehouse workers currently think you went crazy and tried to abandon them to save yourself. You are entirely alone in this hospital room." I stared blankly at the legal contract. Then I looked slowly up at Trent, and then I turned my eyes toward Caroline. They had successfully cornered me with a terrifying level of strategic ruthlessness I had never encountered in my entire life. They had completely weaponized the local legal system, the hospital medical system, and my own trusting community against me. Every possible escape route I could imagine was heavily blocked by their lies. My physical body was broken and bandaged, and my social standing was completely annihilated. I was trapped inside a waking nightmare where telling the actual truth was my absolute greatest liability. Trent tapped his index finger sharply against the blank signature line on the top page of the legal contract. "Caroline already has the involuntary commitment papers fully drafted and approved by the hospital psychiatrist," he said, his voice laced with absolute chilling certainty. "She just has to sign the final authorization line on the bottom of the form, and you will physically disappear into a state mental health facility for a very long time. You can either be a retired and wealthy man who quietly steps down from his company due to unfortunate health reasons, or you can be a heavily medicated patient inside a locked psychiatric ward who lost his entire life because he's stubborn, refused to face reality." Trent stood up straight, smoothing his jacket, and looked down at me with cold and triumphant eyes. He delivered the final devastating ultimatum that sealed my forced exile from my own life. "Sign the company papers right now, Harrison, or you leave this hospital in a straitjacket." "He refuses to modernize," she continued, her voice rising with sudden sharp authority. "He keeps outdated trucking routes active just because the drivers are his friends. He drains our corporate accounts to pay full health care premiums for retirees, completely ignoring the basic principles of profit margins. He is running Oakhaven Logistics straight into the ground out of blind, foolish sentimentality. And if we let him keep pretending he is a CEO, this entire town will suffer when the bankruptcy papers are filed. The second Trent walked out of the intensive care unit, leaving that sickening ultimatum hanging in the sterile air, my survival instinct kicked into overdrive. I waited exactly 3 minutes. The nurse's station was just down the hall, and I could hear the faint rhythmic beeping of monitors keeping time like a metronome. I looked at the intravenous lines taped to the back of my right hand. The skin was angry red and heavily bandaged, but the fury coursing through my veins was far hotter than the burns. I gripped the thick plastic tubing with my teeth and pulled violently. A sharp, localized sting shot up my arm, followed by a warm trickle of blood, but I did not stop. I ripped the sticky heart monitor leads off my chest, silencing the machine by yanking the power cord directly from the wall socket before it could trigger a central alarm. I swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. The cold linoleum floor sent a shockwave up my bare feet. I was wearing nothing but a flimsy, open-backed hospital gown. I frantically scanned the room and spotted a pile of dark blue surgical scrubs resting on a laundry cart near the privacy curtain. Someone from the surgical ward had carelessly left them behind. I pulled the rough cotton over my head, wincing in absolute agony as the fabric rubbed against my raw, blistered shoulders. I shoved my feet into a pair of rubber slip-on shoes sitting by the door, completely ignoring the fact that they were 2 sizes too small. I crept out into the hallway. The night shift was notoriously understaffed. I kept my head down, mirroring the exhausted, slumped posture of a medical resident finishing a grueling rotation. I bypassed the main elevator bank, knowing the security cameras would easily track my movements, and opted instead for the heavy concrete stairwell. Pushing open the heavy fire door with my severely burned hands was pure torture. Every ounce of pressure felt like driving rusty nails directly into my palms. I descended 4 flights of stairs, my breath echoing harshly against the cinder-block walls. When I finally pushed through the ground floor exit, the heavy metal door clicked shut behind me, sealing my escape. I was out. The moment I stepped onto the asphalt, the biting reality of an early November morning hit me. The wind was sharp and merciless, cutting through the thin cotton scrubs like a razor blade. The sky was an ugly, bruised shade of gray, threatening an imminent downpour. I had no wallet, no keys, and no phone. The only thing I possessed was a singular burning need to secure whatever financial resources I had left before Caroline could finish tightening the noose around my neck. The nearest branch of my commercial bank was exactly 3 miles away, located right in the center of the downtown district. I started walking. Every step sent a jolt of pain up my shins. My lungs, still heavily compromised from the toxic black smoke of the garage fire, protested with a dry, rattling cough that shook my entire ribcage. Cars sped past me on the main road, kicking up dirty mist and gravel from the gutters. Pedestrians on the morning commute stopped to stare. I looked like a vagrant, a completely broken shell of the man who had stood at a country club podium just hours earlier in a tailored suit. I forced myself to focus on putting one foot in front of the other. The 3 miles felt like a brutal, endless marathon. By the time the familiar brick and glass facade of my bank came into view, my feet were blistered and bleeding inside the borrowed rubber shoes. I pushed through the heavy double doors. The warm, conditioned air of the lobby offered a brief, deceptive sense of comfort. I walked straight up to the main teller counter, leaving wet, dirty footprints on the pristine marble floor. The woman behind the glass was named Sarah. She had been cashing my company payroll checks for 7 years. I knew her husband. I had sponsored her daughter's softball team. She looked up, her welcoming customer service smile freezing instantly as she took in my disheveled appearance. The dark soot still streaked across my neck and the heavy white gauze wrapping my bleeding hands. "Harrison," she stammered, her eyes darting nervously toward the armed security guard standing near the vault. "What on earth happened to you?" I leaned heavily against the marble counter, my legs shaking from severe exhaustion. I need to make a cash withdrawal, Sarah. I need it right now. Just pull up my personal checking account. She hesitated, her fingers hovering anxiously over the keyboard. She typed in my name. The computer screen reflected a harsh blue light across her face. Her expression shifted rapidly from shock to deep, unmistakable discomfort. Harrison. I cannot access your accounts, she said softly. Her voice was trembling. What do you mean you cannot access them? I demanded, fighting to keep my tone level and calm. I have over $80,000 in that personal account alone. Sarah stepped back from the glass, picking up her desk phone. I need to get the branch manager. Less than a minute later, Thomas, a man I had played golf with for a decade, emerged from the back executive offices. He did not extend his hand in greeting. He kept a very cautious distance, holding a thick manila folder tightly against his chest. Harrison, you really should not be here, Thomas said, his tone thick with rigid corporate protocol and misplaced pity. We received an emergency court order via legal courier right at the opening of business today. Your wife, Caroline, filed a rapid temporary restraining order. She also submitted a notarized medical proxy and a psychiatric hold affidavit signed by the county hospital.